Retomaremos, hemos hecho un pequeño retraso de unos minutos. Yo intentaré ser sintética para que continuamos, ¿no? Nos mantengamos en los tiempos. Me presentaré, ya que estoy conmigo misma aquí, ¿no? Dime.
¿Quieres que te presente?
No hace falta, brevemente. Muchos de vosotros ya me conocéis porque estáis dentro del curso que estamos llevando a cabo de Arte Contemporáneo Chino. Soy Laia Manonelles, profesora de esta casa de la Universidad de Barcelona, y parte de mi investigación sobre la producción de los artistas contemporáneos chinos, y estoy formando parte conjuntamente con Joaquín Beltrán, Amelia Saiz, a Roberto Filulio y otras personas del Grupo InterAsia, y estamos desarrollando investigación en relación a las producciones culturales de China en un contexto euroamericano principalmente. Y en la sesión de hoy yo quería presentaros de manera breve una presentación en relación a la subversión de la narrativa del arte experimental. Quería otra vez agradecer el formato de las jornadas, porque creo que nos ayudan a poder ir nutriendo nuestras investigaciones, y justamente hace 2 años, creo recordar, presenté el trabajo de un colectivo, Mat for Real, me centré en unas obras. Hoy quería trabajar con otras obras, para continuar evolucionando y que también se genere este diálogo cruzado. Quería empezar con esta reflexión de James Elkins, The Stories of Art, donde él hace una propuesta a diferentes compañeros de la universidad. Él es docente, investigador y también alumnos y alumnas, y les propone pues, que hagan un mapa que concrete de manera directa aquello que ellos consideran que son los momentos más representativos, los artistas más relevantes de la historia del arte que ellos están recibiendo, en la cual se están formando, y él nos propone en su libro, nos facilita una imagen, es la propuesta de uno de sus alumnos, donde nosotros podemos ver que esta persona lo que hace es, evidentemente, pues quien tiene más espacios, el expresionismo abstracto norteamericano, Monet, etcétera, etcétera, los grandes popes, los autores que todos y todas conocéis, pero el Chinese Art and African Art son 2 aliens. Este concepto de alien lo recuperaré porque creo que es importante, cuando estamos hablando de la recepción de otros marcos culturales en un contexto euroamericano. Los alumnos se disculpan porque es políticamente incorrecto, pero Elkins dice que justamente lo importante es que se muestre, ¿no? Aquello con lo cual se han formado. ¿Y por qué es alien? Sencillamente porque no lo conocen, es así de claro. En la presentación de hoy me gustaba esta idea de reflexionar sobre la subversión de este relato oficial de la historia del arte, que es quiénes son los principales autores, quiénes son las principales obras que encontramos en todos los manuales, en todas las diferentes exposiciones. Hay un relato del arte oficial también en el arte experimental, y veremos cómo justamente estos 2 artistas, Mat for Real, que se conocieron de manera breve en la China, pero empezaron a trabajar conjuntamente cuando los 2 se fueron a estudiar y a vivir en Londres, que conectará con muchas reflexiones también que ha expuesto Joaquín Beltrán en su primera presentación. Ellos formarán parte de un colectivo, Mat for Real, y en varias de sus obras, yo aquí hago una pequeñísima selección, lo que hacen es dialogar con estas obras totémicas de la historia del arte euroamericanas, entre ellas La fuente de Duchamp, que todos la conocéis perfectísimamente y la habréis estudiado en más de una ocasión. Luego recuperar esta obra. Antes de hablar de estos autores y de las series que yo he seleccionado, porque tiene una producción muy amplia y una buena página web para quien quiera entrar y consultar más, quería recordar cuál es su biografía. Justamente tenemos que tener presentes que ambos autores son nacidos en China, pero los 2 emigran a Gran Bretaña en lo que es inicios de los 80 o mediados de los 80. Los 2 continúan formándose en el contexto británico. Esto también es importante mencionarlo. No solamente reciben formación en China, sino que continúan sus formaciones en másteres en prestigiosas universidades en Londres. Y En este primer momento de trabajo, de inmersión, de diálogo transcultural, intercultural o de dificultad de diálogo, realizarán una serie de obras que yo expuse en la jornada que trabajamos conjuntamente hace 2 años, que quiero solamente citar a modo de recordatorio porque creo que nos ayuda a entender cómo hay una parte importante de su producción. En esta batalla de soja y la salsa de ketchup, por ejemplo, en los espacios públicos toman la calle, pero también la realizarán en espacios galerísticos. Aquí también podemos reflexionar, si queréis, a posteriori entre cuando se trabaja en lo que es el espacio público de la calle directamente, interceptando la calle, cuando es institucionalizado, ¿no? Estas prácticas artísticas. Luego, si queréis, lo retomamos. Pero lo que es interesante es que ellos hablan de estas luchas dicotómicas, este-oeste, los estereotipos, cómo son vistos, cómo se sienten ellos rechazados en este contexto británico. Justamente Gao Minglu, que es uno de los historiadores de arte contemporáneo chino, él habla de este tercer espacio que antes mencionaba Roberto, este third space. Y habla también del gran esfuerzo que hacen los creadores que inician estos procesos migratorios para ubicarse en estos nuevos marcos, en este nuevo marco británico, en este caso concreto, y trascender estas dicotomías entre este occidente a partir de las diferentes estrategias culturales e intentar de ir más allá de estos estereotipos, de estas expectativas, de eso que se espera que tiene que aportar una artista chino, ¿no? En un entorno euroamericano. De manera muy breve, solamente mostraros algunas imágenes de estas series donde ellos mismos se refieren, ¿no? Como esta especie de Chinese aliens, ¿no? En espacios privilegiados de Londres, en el Buckingham Palace, en el Trafalgar Square, estos cuerpos bárbaros que ellos mismos ubican en diferentes espacios de la ciudad, en contraposición de estas altas culturas occidentales civilizadas, esta idea de lo bárbaro versus lo civilizado, que es la sociedad británica, que el peligro amarillo, ¿no? Y todos los estereotipos de Fu Manchu aparecerían. Y estas imágenes ellos las pondrán en diferentes pues, paradas de metro de Londres, en diferentes espacios públicos, para interpelar también, evidentemente, a lo que es la ciudadanía. Os quería mostrar estas imágenes a modo de prefacio, y esta también en relación a todo el proceso larguísimo para poder tener la nacionalidad, la residencia, etcétera, etcétera, y también pues, los procesos, ¿no? tan dificultosos para poder sentirse, ¿no? Como una persona de plenos derechos en esta nueva ciudad de acogida en la que llevan ya muchos años viviendo y trabajando. Pero en la sesión de hoy yo quería centrarme en lo que es propiamente cómo ellos dialogan con estas obras que aparecen en las instituciones principales de Londres, entre ellas la Tate Gallery. En 99 hay una obra de Tracy Emin, que es My Bed, que gana el Turner Prize, sabéis, ¿no? La gran relevancia de estos premios. Esta obra aparece justamente como hemos visto, en la Tate Gallery. Es una obra donde Tracy Emin reflexiona sobre un periodo depresivo en el que está varios días en su casa, en su cama. La cama está rodeada, pues, sea de pastillas, de alcohol, de ropa interior. Está todo hecho un caos, como podemos ver, que anuncia este estado depresivo, de caos, de dificultad que vivía el artista. Y los dos artistas de Mad for Real deciden irrumpir en este espacio sacro, que es la Tate, y saltar directamente sobre esta cama. Os podéis imaginar, ¿no? lo que sucedió. Una gran recepción a partir de los medios, ¿no? Estos dos bárbaros que saltan sobre una obra de arte, ¿no? Consolidada, referenciada. Estos dos cuerpos chinos, ¿no? Que están saltando, y tenemos que pensar que la obra también termina en relación a la recepción crítica, porque los artistas en el catálogo, esta es una fotografía que he extraído del catálogo, también recogen la recepción, porque son conscientes. Ellos fueron arrestados, fueron detenidos. Varios de los periodistas dicen, ¿no?, que entraron cubiertos con un grupo de turistas japoneses, que uno de los testimonios dice que es mentira, pero bueno, ¿no?, lo que es propiamente el contexto del otro, nosotros y los otros, aparece continuamente en este trabajo, ¿no?, que gritaban en mandarín, ¿no?, con un grupo de japoneses, ya no sabemos si son japoneses, si son chinos, ¿no?, el asiático todo es parecido en este reduccionismo. Y es interesante justamente cuando vemos estas diferentes obras, como también nos habla otra de las autoras que analiza esta obra en la página web de Mad for Real, ¿no?, cómo los guardias de seguridad tardan a interrumpirles porque se piensan que son expertos en Kung Fu, ¿no? Todos los tópicos se van, ¿no?, apareciendo cuando vemos una obra de estas características, cuando ellos lo que quieren, justamente, este es otro de los trabajos que se ha colado aquí y no tenía que estar aquí. Cuando ellos hicieron esta acción, presentaron un manifiesto. Dentro de este manifiesto se presentaron justamente como disidentes del arte, ¿no?, y cómo se tiene que desafiar el arte de hoy en día, cómo tenemos que ir más allá, ¿no?, sea chillando, corriendo, ¿no?, etcétera, etcétera. Hay esta actitud irreverente que se nos presenta en relación también a una crítica institucional que neutraliza ciertas obras de arte que acaban siendo sacras, y continuamente os voy recogiendo diferentes mensajes procedentes de artículos y de notas de prensa donde nos hablan de esta idea que hay algo que no se puede digerir, que esta especie, ¿no?, de hooligans que van y saltan en una obra que es reconocida. Y es interesante también como Katie Hill, que es una de las estudiosas de Mad for Real, nos habla que esta obra evidentemente complica el discurso, ¿no?, de esta relación de diferentes marcos por cuestiones de género, de raza, políticas, art education and class, porque ellos justamente no hacen énfasis en todas estas notas de prensa que son unos artistas que se han formado también en el Reino Unido, y después de cuántos años continúan siendo extranjeros cuando ya forman parte, ¿no?, de la sociedad. Uno de ellos se ha casado con una británica, tiene hijos, etcétera, etcétera. Toda esta cosa, hasta cuándo serás el otro, aparece en muchos de los textos. Y también os quería compartir esta imagen de una obra donde nos invitó a todas las personas que estábamos ahí a saltar sobre esta cama en Beijing, y para ver también que en otros contextos, en otros espacios, las obras tienen un significado absolutamente distinto. Aquí era lúdico absolutamente, era un opening en un espacio que estaba facilitado por Chan Xing, que es otro artista contemporáneo chino. Ellos hacían una exposición, una residencia, y a las personas que fuimos ese día nos invitaron a que saltásemos en la cama, pero el tono, el punto de partida es absolutamente distinto del que hemos visto en la Tate, que es uno de los espacios de privilegio del arte contemporáneo internacional. Aquí tenemos la fuente que antes os anunciaba, de manera rápida también para irme ajustando a los tempos. Os quería mencionar cómo ellos también proponen una subversión a lo que es la institucionalización de una obra irreverente por excelencia, que es la fuente de Duchamp. Duchamp nunca se hubiera imaginado que hubiera formado parte del relato oficial de la historia del arte dentro de una vitrina, como podéis ver. Pues ellos lo que hacen, lo que nos proponen es urinar para hacer un homenaje a Duchamp, lo que es propiamente la esencia de Dada, el anti-arte, la anti-institución, la anti-historia del arte. Y en las notas de prensa, evidentemente, os podéis imaginar, ¿no?, Mad for Real, ¿no?, están atacando el canon europeo, ¿no?, esta idea de los extranjeros, aunque haga muchos años que están viviendo ahí, que tengan familia, etcétera, etcétera, continúan siendo estos otros. Y esta idea de los otros, ellos lo integran en muchas obras, porque ellos son muy conscientes de que también los detendrían, que luego los liberarían, que habría muchos titulares, y esto también termina la obra, como decíamos, al igual que la obra previa que os he mencionado y hasta a posteriori hacen esta especie, ¿no?, de reliquia, que también podemos hablar de esta connotación, de crear un objeto de un acto performativo. En todo caso, en las dos obras también no es lo mismo intervenir una obra de Tracy Emin, que ella también expuso su malestar, ¿no?, su denuncia al acto vandálico terrorista de estos artistas chinos, a intervenir una obra de Duchamp, que ya hace muchos más años que está en circulación dentro de este relato oficial. No hay las mismas connotaciones en una que en otra obra. De manera también breve, no quería dejar de mencionar que los artistas continúan reflexionando sobre el poder de la institución, sobre la hegemonía de la institución, en este caso en el opening de Koons, Jeff Koons, que es otro de los grandes artistas contemporáneos, ¿no?, reconocido a nivel internacional, el mercado del arte. Y en este caso concreto, fijaros que ellos nos aparecen también como una especie de gángsters, la mafia, estas mafias que aparecen acompañando en muchas ocasiones el relato de estos otros, de estos ciudadanos chinos en un contexto británico, y lo que hacen de una manera directa es enfocar la endogamia de lo que es el mundo del arte. Y en este enfocar la endogamia no solamente hablan de lo que sucede en Londres, sino que también de lo que sucede en China, en la inauguración de la Bienal de Shanghai del año 2000, pues ellos arrestarán a Zhou Hanru, el curador, porque consideran que se está perpetrando esta mala praxis de unos círculos cerrados, de los amigos más íntimos de un curador que siempre aparece en unas exposiciones, otros que están siempre fuera. Es decir, el poder de visibilizar o invisibilizar, de que entras o no entras en estos círculos, continúan enfocándolo, sea en Londres o sea en Shanghai, como vemos en estas obras que os mencionaba. Y yendo al último tramo de mi presentación, también quería introducir, porque creo que es muy importante, qué sucede en relación a otras obras canónicas que aparecen en el British Museum. Aquí ya no estamos hablando de obras contemporáneas experimentales, sino que estamos hablando del legado clásico europeo, y ellos se presentan como estos Monkey Kings, ¿no?, que causan este caos, ¿no?, esta especie de irrupción en este palacio celestial que podríamos interpretar como el British Museum. Ellos encarnan, reinterpretan, hacen una relectura de lo que es propiamente un mito de la historia china, de la tradición, este Monkey King, que es una novela donde tenemos este viaje a Occidente. Toman un personaje mítico de su propia tradición, se lo apropian y lo reubican para hablarnos de su propio viaje a Occidente. Y fijaros cómo se nos presentan aquí otra vez estos cuerpos bárbaros, aunque hacen alusión directa también a su propia tradición, pero están dialogando en relación a estas obras clásicas, con esta máscara. El sentido del humor, la ironía, forma parte de su trabajo para establecer estas relaciones interculturales, transculturales, en todas estas obras. Una estrategia diferente a otros autores, como podéis ver en esta imagen, donde cuando deciden representar un momento emblemático de su tradición, deciden coger un literato, ¿no? O no esta idea del Monkey King, que es una idea más, podríamos decir, más irreverente. En Victorian and Albert Museum exactamente lo mismo. También aquí aparece el elemento de ellos como monos, pero aquí con un traje, también una stripper, esta idea de lo parateatral, esta idea de cómo se irrumpe un espacio sacro como el Victorian and Albert Museum o el British Museum o la Tate, como veíamos antes. En todo caso, para ir concluyendo, porque creo que también, ¿no?, tenemos que ir ajustándonos en estos timings, la jornada es larga. La última referencia que quería daros de obra que ellos reinterpretan y dialogan en relación a la historia del arte europeo es este grito de Munch, que todos también tenéis en la retina, y ellos deciden en el 2012, la primera vez que performan esta acción es en la Tate Britain, en el puente. Deciros que de las series que os he presentado, la mayoría son series, no es solamente una obra, yo he hecho una pequeña selección. Y aquí dentro de la Tate, en la sala de las turbinas, gritando, invitan a la gente también a que griten en expresión directa a un malestar sistémico que estamos viviendo todos, porque es una obra que realizarán en varias ocasiones. Recordar esta expresión del malestar, del desasosiego, del vacío existencial de Moore, pues esta misma idea de este ahogo es del que nos presenta Matt for Real en Londres, en Venecia en el pabellón alemán, o aquí podéis verlo también en otro de los espacios públicos. Y me interesaba, para concluir, para ir cerrando la presentación, recuperar una reflexión de Katie Hill en relación a este poner el cuerpo, a esta voz, a escuchar esta voz, la importancia de tomar la palabra, de gritar en este caso concreto. Creo que es muy importante en relación a esta necesidad de reescribir la historia, estos imaginarios, estas asimetrías que mencionaba Joaquín Beltrán en el inicio de la sesión de hoy, estos estereotipos, cómo dialogan, cómo se deconstruyen, y a partir del humor, de la ironía, de esta reflexión hacia el otro, o como también Amelia nos hablaba de otras representaciones también, y ellos lo que nos hacen es representarnos a estas otras posibilidades, diálogos, para que rumiemos sobre estas asimetrías y construyamos otros parámetros que creo que tienen que ir buscándose en este espacio in between. Dejaré aquí mi presentación y a continuación le daré la palabra a Binghui. Voy a salir. A continuación tendremos la presentación de Binghui Zheng, que ya nació en Shenzhen, en China. Se graduó en la Facultad de Historia del Arte en la Academia de Bellas Artes de Guangzhou en el 2015 y estudió el máster en Historia del Arte en la Universidad de Barcelona, y actualmente es doctoranda en la Universidad de Barcelona, centrándose justamente en el Little Elephant, que hoy hará la presentación en relación a este proceso de investigación doctoral. Muchas gracias.
Gracias.
Adelante.
Primero de todo, pues gracias a Fundación Instituto Confuci, Universitat de Barcelona y también InterAsia. Y sobre todo gracias a Laia para darme esta oportunidad de presentar mi investigación. Pues mi título es El arte experimental después de 1985 en Guangzhou, Pigtail Elephant como caso de estudio. Pigtail Elephant es un colectivo basado en la ciudad de Guangzhou que consiste en 4 artistas. Y para empezar, quería instituir este contexto histórico. En 1976 se finalizó la Revolución Cultural. Pues para empezar, pues quiero introducir el contexto histórico. Y se finalizó la Revolución Cultural en 1976 y después las actividades artísticas del Grupo de las Estrellas y también el movimiento de la nueva ola marcaron un giro muy gigante en el panorama de arte chino. Y después, en 1986, el artista Wang Du fundó el colectivo Salón de Artistas del Sur, y este colectivo es considerado como colectivo antecedente de Pigtail Elephant. Y después, en 1989, se celebró en Beijing la famosa exposición China Avant-garde. Y un año después, 3 miembros del Salón de Artistas del Sur fundaron el colectivo Pigtail Elephant. 2 años después, 1992, el máximo líder, Deng Xiaoping, visitó a la ciudad de Guangzhou, y así que reforzó la implementación de las reformas urbanísticas de las ciudades del sur, sobre todo. Y este evento histórico es el background principal de la creación de Pigtail Elephant. Y con respecto al colectivo, que en toda la década de 1980 surgieron un centenar de colectivos por todas las provincias de China. Y sobre todo, quería remarcar que el individualismo dentro del marco de colectivo es fundamental. En el caso de Picture Elephant, la autoría de las obras de ellos es de un solo artista, aunque ellos siempre organizaron exposiciones conjuntamente. Y sobre el vínculo entre los artistas, Cao Minglu, el investigador de arte chino, también mencionó esto en uno de sus artículos. Ya que el arte no oficial no estaba permitido a entrar en las instituciones, así que para llegar a organizar exposiciones underground con éxito, pues se requería la solidaridad entre los artistas. Y este fenómeno o esta situación fortaleció los vínculos personales entre los artistas. Ese es un punto muy importante en aquella época, ¿no? Y a continuación quería ubicar la ciudad de Guangzhou. Y aquí he marcado en rojo la región del delta del río de las Perlas. La ciudad de Guangzhou se sitúa en la provincia de Guangdong. Y aquí podemos ver con más detalles. Guangzhou está en este punto rojo y Hong Kong tiene como unos 130 kilómetros. De Hong Kong a Hong Kong está aquí, de Hong Kong a Guangzhou. Y Beijing está aquí. Y sobre todo Beijing es como un centro de muchos movimientos artísticos muy importante, ¿no? Y sucedió todo en Beijing y también en la zona del norte, ¿no? Y en este caso, en comparación con Beijing, pues la zona del sur se quedó en una posición relativamente marginal. Y en esta foto podemos ver un seminario del Salón de Artistas del Sur, y en la década 80 se solía celebrar seminarios para debatir cuestiones filosóficas debido a la ola de la traducción masiva de las obras filosóficas occidentales. Y esta es una foto de 1986. Y después, en 1989, el mismo año de la exposición China Avant-garde, este colectivo, Salón de Artistas del Sur, se celebró, llevó a cabo la única exposición, la primera exposición experimental, y después de este evento artístico se disolvió y también el organizador principal, Wang Du, fue exiliado a Francia por razón política. Y ahora podemos ver esta foto de Picture Elephant. De izquierda a derecha son Liang Zhihui, Lin Yilin, Xu Tan. Xu Tan incorporó a este colectivo 2 años después de la fundación, y Chen Shaoxiong. En realidad, Picture Elephant tiene un nombre más completo, ¿no? Grupo de trabajo de Picture Elephant. Y grupo de trabajo es un término para referirse a un tipo de organizaciones establecidas y consentidas por Mao Zedong en la Revolución Cultural. Y en cambio, Picture Elephant es una expresión ilógica y tiene una pincelada de dadaísmo, ¿no? Y de este modo, los artistas demostraron una actitud de burla y también un sentido de humor negro. Y estas características podemos ver durante todas las creaciones de ellos. Y al inicio de 1990, la reforma urbanística transformó radicalmente las ciudades, y muchos artistas empezaron a enfocarse en este tema desde la perspectiva sociológica. Y actualmente la transformación urbanística también es un tema muy importante. Y en esta performance, que duró más o menos 1 hora y media, el artista montó un muro de ladrillo y después va moviendo los ladrillos de uno a uno creando un lento movimiento para atravesar esta carretera. Y así que puede causar un atasco de tráfico brevemente y interrumpió la normalidad de la ciudad. Y esta intervención directa en la calle es muy significativo, ¿no? Y también hay que destacar que el ladrillo es un elemento que Lin Yilin usa muy frecuentemente y es un símbolo del material en la construcción urbanística. Con la base de la obra anterior, Lin Yilin también desarrolló otra obra que se llama Drive Shaft. Se realizó años antes de la transferencia de Hong Kong del gobierno en carrera a China continental. Y en la primera foto podemos ver que Lin Yilin escribió los nombres de partidos políticos de Hong Kong en el muro. Y después movió los ladrillos de la misma manera en el centro de Hong Kong durante 4 días. Y así que desordenó las letras de los nombres y va perdiendo los sentidos de los nombres de partidos políticos. Y es muy evidente que de este modo manifestó su crítica y también su preocupación a la situación política de Hong Kong y también a la relación entre Hong Kong y China continental. Ahora podemos ver la otra obra de Chen Shaoxiong, que es una serie de fotografía, Street. Chen Shaoxiong tomó fotos de muchos detalles de la ciudad y después hizo un collage con estas fotos y podemos ver como estatua, arco, peatones. Y después de un tiempo volvió a la calle a fotografiar el collage que había hecho y también el paisaje de la ciudad. Y podemos ver la mano de este artista. Y de este modo, él creó una ciudad mixta de pasado, de este collage, y también de actual, ficticia y real. En esta justaposición pues, nos propone la pregunta, ¿cómo sería una ciudad para nosotros, ¿no? O cómo sería una ciudad ideal? Y en realidad, Chen Shaoxiong no solo centrarse en el tema local, sino también se centrarse en los temas globales, como por ejemplo es Anti-Terrorism Variety del artista. Es un videoarte y realizó después de atentado en Nueva York en el día 11 de septiembre de 2001. Propuso una estrategia surrealista y un poco absurda, ¿no? Para afrontar el terrorismo. De una manera muy semejante a la obra de Lin Yilin que atravesó la carretera, Liang Zhihui también creó una obra, One Hour Game. Pues en esta performance, el artista ocupó un ascensor en la construcción, en un rascacielos, y jugó durante 1 hora un videojuego que se llama Batalla de la Ciudad. Y este nombre de este juego también es muy simbólico. Y esta intervención directa en la construcción in situ y también es muy evidentemente que es muy reivindicativo. Y por último quería mostrar esta escena de Xu Tan y es una instalación y a través de esta escena quería recuperar la escena precaria de muchos trabajadores inmigrantes que vinieron de otras provincias a Guangzhou. Y la condición de muchos trabajadores inmigrantes es un foco de atención durante todo el proceso de transformación urbanística. Y ahora vamos a pasar a la parte de análisis de las exposiciones. En total, Picture Elephant, este grupo, llevó a cabo 5 exposiciones underground en Guangzhou. Se solía durar solamente unos días, con máximo una semana y pico. Y una parte de las obras que ya acabo de presentar previamente Y podemos analizar un poco los sitios en concreto de estas exposiciones. La primera exposición se sitúa en el Palacio Cultural de los Trabajadores y la segunda está en un sótano de la universidad. Y son espacios ligados a la educación, a la cultura, ¿no? Así que puede tener un cierto público. Y también quería remarcar la tercera exposición está en un bar Red End. Era un punto de encuentro de los artistas de Guangzhou. Y también una parte de esta exposición, la obra de Liang Zhihui fue realizada en el espacio domicilio de propia casa de Liang Zhihui. Y pues esto ya pertenece a apartment art, ¿no? Y también sobre todo en la cuarta exposición No Room, que significa no hay espacio, que realizó también en un apartamento. Y este título, No Room, fue puesto por Hou Hanru, el curador, recriminó por la falta de espacio expositivo para los artistas experimentales. Y también la quinta exposición se celebró también en un sótano, así que el público realmente era muy limitado y solo se centra en el círculo de artistas. A partir de 1997, un momento, volvemos a... Y así que en este contexto, algunas obras acabó realizando directamente en las calles, ya que no puede encontrar un espacio apropiado. Y por un lado, la selección de estos sitios es una exploración de espacios marginales del urbanismo. Y así que puede aprovechar las grietas del sistema y llevar a cabo una insección, una intervención, e incluso experimento urbano en la ciudad. Y por otro lado, también representa la resistencia y una rebeldía contra el arte oficial. Y a partir de 1997, Picture Elephant empezó a participar en muchas exposiciones internacionales, y algunas exposiciones más importantes que participó el Picture Elephant son estas exposiciones. Y cabe remarcar que Hou Hanru es la figura muy relevante para introducir este colectivo en la esfera internacional. Y quería concluir en unos puntos clave de este colectivo. En general, las obras de ellos reflejan la transformación urbanística y también los cambios sociales de Guangzhou a través de performance, instalación, fotografía, videoarte. Construyó su propia forma de expresión. Y cabe precisar que muchas obras intervinieron en sitios específicos, así que puede generar varias capas de significados sociales y provoca la interacción con el público y también la reacción de la sociedad. Y también un punto muy importante que es la cotidianidad. Este enfoque en la vida cotidiana también construye un nuevo discurso basado en la vida ciudadana. Y he hecho unos estudios comparativos entre Picture Elephant y las corrientes artísticas coetáneas. En el caso del neorealismo y la nueva generación, que principalmente está basado en Beijing, estas corrientes comparten unos puntos comunes con Picture Elephant, como por ejemplo la nueva estructura de la narrativa, el relato basado en la cotidianidad y también el enfoque en el cambio urbanístico. Y en el caso del pop político, el realismo cínico, que son dos corrientes que ha entrado en el mercado internacional con todo éxito, ¿no? Y estas corrientes presentan normalmente símbolos o imágenes políticas que se permite identificar con mucha facilidad. Y este punto justamente, precisamente, es lo que intentan renunciar Picture Elephant. Y Picture Elephant intenta expresarse de una manera muy distinta y pretende posicionarse fuera de la dicotomía este-oeste y muestra la resistencia contra la dualidad. Y en relación con apartment art, pues debido a la marginación social y la limitación y la restricción de espacios expositivos, una parte de las obras de Victor Elephant perteneció a la corriente de apartment art. Para acabar, pues aquí es la conclusión. A través de la intervención urbana, tanto en las exposiciones underground como las creaciones en sí, Victor Elephant pretendió lanzar el arte con una realidad social. Y también Victor Elephant, como uno de los colectivos de arte experimental, se posicionó con su particularidad en el escenario global. Basándose en el contexto de la región del Delta, del Río de las Perlas, llegó a fomentar el arraigo social en esta región y construyó sus propios relatos, ayudando a impulsar lo local como nueva fuerza en las relaciones internacionales. Y al mismo tiempo, sus enfoques hacia la reforma urbanística y el asunto geopolítico no dejaron de ser cuestiones transnacionales. Gracias por vuestra atención.
Muchísimas gracias, Binghui. Si te parece bien, si puedes cerrar la presentación y a continuación daremos la palabra a Mei Huang, que ya está aquí con nosotros desde China. Hi, Mei.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Laia.
Haré la breve presentación de Mei. Ella es curadora, es escritora, es crítica de arte, está viviendo en Barcelona, aunque en este periodo la ha cogido que está en China, y ella ha hecho el máster de comisariado en el Goldsmith College de la University of London en el 2014. Ella está desarrollando el doctorado en la Universidad de Barcelona y ella también ha sido la investigadora curadora researcher del Center for Chinese Contemporary Art en Manchester, y ella también ha ido desarrollando diferentes proyectos tanto en China como en el contexto euroamericano. Está trabajando como representante de las relaciones internacionales con Asia en la Universidad Blanquerna, aquí al lado, la tenemos al lado, y a continuación nos hará su presentación donde también nos aportará varias cuestiones que está desarrollando en su investigación. Adelante, Mei, gracias por estar con nosotros desde China.
Thank you, Laia. Thank you for your detailed introduction. And also, I'm very glad to be here. And also thank you for Confuci Institute and InterAsia to co-host this conference. And I am going to talk through this presentation in English. If anyone didn't understand properly, you can, comment it in the comment box, and I'm going to check after my presentation. So I'm going to go very fast because I know that we are a little bit late. Well, a little bit late of the schedule. So let's go through then. First of all, okay.
Share.
I share.
To share the file.
Yeah. Okay. Here we are.
Perfect.
Let me have a look first. Okay.
Perfect.
So the presentation's topic is called the cultural diversity and difference lost, Chinese homogenization in contemporary art and the popular culture disciplines. And when we talk about the topic, actually, we are talking about one question. Well, it's a sub-question of the topic, how Chinese contemporary art presents social and cultural margins. Well, this is part of my PhD research and questions, and I use exhibitions and visual art to visualize the topic from different generations of artists and curators to approach the same subjects through the in temporal level, let's say, go through the Chinese history and culture. Actually, from this question, I interviewed quite a lot of curators and artists. It's an in-depth interview several times. For example, from Chang'e, Inner Mongolia artist, from Yunnan, only signed Chinese Magnum photographer, and Hou Hanru, who has been mentioned a lot of times. I guess he's going to be surprised that he has been appeared as 3 people in this presentation, but I'm going to go through very detailed in the different part of the presentation. So how do we define margins? Well, from academic theory aspects, I'm drawing on the series of, or let's say this is a series I'm building on the previous works of Lugo, Morales, and Vatude. I hope I pronounce it correct, but if you want to know, the full name, you can email me later, or you can ask me, I can type it on the screen. So after this, after all these previous works, we divide it in 2 aspects. So the frontiers, geographical borders, which related to the ethnic issues, or the second, invisible borders that scattered throughout the country from economical and religion levels. So this presentation is also going to be divided in these 2 parts, and I'm going to go through the first part, then the second part. And also, some people may ask why you use art to visualize, and why art is related with these problems. So I'm quoting from Carol Duhan. Art is a craft-based tool for study of consciousness. It is a visual language that with the power to tell us more in the blink of the eye that we might learn hours of listening and reading. So actually, when we see let's say a work, a piece of art, or a photograph, or whatever, you define art, and there is a lot of information we can get rather than reading perhaps 1 page. And you can also get some kind of sense from the consciousness and unconsciousness from the artist, or let's say the curator level. The first part we're going to talk about is frontier border issues. Here we're going to talk in 3 parts: Xinjiang, Tibet, and Inner Mongolia. You can see the pictures here actually is the work from Chang'e, and it's called the Miniature Long March from 2002 and 2005. Why I put the picture here is for those who doesn't very familiar with the Chinese map, and you can see here, from Xinjiang and Tibet and Inner Mongolia, we all have the borders and the frontiers with another country. So this creates this kind of complex and dynamic culture and art situation that we are going to analyze through the presentation. So the first work we're going to talk about is from Chang'e. Chang'e, just for the short introduction, is a Mongol ethnic artist who was born in Inner Mongolia in 1971. His practice are mainly focused on linking contemporary art with the current social political reality and situation in China, showing possible culture, religion, geographical diversities that are created by the different ethnic community. So the miniature long march here I'm showing is a process. It's from 2002 to 2005 as a part of the Long March project of Lu Jie. This work has 2 parts. The first part is to tattoo, to record the route of the Long March team, which I think is okay. But the most interesting, the second part, Chang'e, he brought his own team to visualize work in progress in the glassland and the snow mountain. I think it is not only illustrates a relationship between the artistic practice and also the body, but also mixing the concept with the race, ethnic identity, territory, frontiers, flesh and self-experiences. So it's actually a self-consciousness seeking of identity. And then we go through the second project of Chang'e. I think it's also a continuation of his inner reflection. So when we talk about glassland in Inner Mongolia, we think about environmental problem of the glassland. Actually, it is based on the field research and the interviews by the artist. So in the past, the glassland has no borders, as we can imagine, this kind of picture of the glassland. But now the government distributes the pastures to the farmers, also the animals as land contracting. So with the fence, actually people cannot pass through the grassland, and also animals are gathered in the specific location to eat the grass. That causes environmental problems. So the artist took the glass fence he has seen in his hometown and brought this to the exhibition. So you can see actually this glass fence has separated the audience from the work, video work, and the photographies he has taken. So creates this kind of separation. So what he thinks that is, I'm quoting, nomadism has become fixed patriarchalism, and social order has changed nature. So this kind of isolation is also invisible and visible boundaries between the, maybe the communities, the regions, all the people and nature. And now we go to the next region, because I have to go very fast rather than develop it deep, because I actually have quite a lot of pages to explain. So the next project I'm going to talk about is called Dirty Realism. It's Liu Xiaodong's He project and Xinjiang research from 2012 and curated by Ho. For those who doesn't very familiar with this curator, so I just gave a short introduction. He is a Chinese-born French curator, born in 1963, and he has made a great contribution towards art globalization discourse, especially about internationalization of Chinese contemporary art, offering an anti-hegemonic discourse and promoting changes of the city urbanization and cosmopolitan in his project. And this project is a very special project because Dirty Realism is a starting and testing ground by Ho, using contemporary art as a media to touch Xinjiang issues for the first time. It eventually dealt with controversial dispute of culture, geopolitics, and geopolitical boundaries between Xinjiang province and China. So it, by breaking the heritage of ethnical symbols and exotic places, try to build an open platform for communication and the discussion of the counterbalance misunderstandings of lack of the context between two regions and people. And I probably going to also talk about a little bit about the artist. So Liu Xiaodong, I think everyone knows, he is a painter and he's very famous contract with the Leeson Gallery in London. And Liu Xiaodong's paintings, I put a big piece here, as you can see very detailedly, basically are daily lives of the local people and landscape in Hetian. He also made quite a lot of diaries and writings there, during his, let's say, life sketching. So, but from the reading through and research all these diaries and writings, I found a slight uncontrollable expression of fear and class distance can be detected in his writings. And it's also a bit difficult to interpret the intentions of the pieces without reading the curatorial text. And as you can see here in this painting, like most of his previous works, it's like, the models looking at the camera, and it is like you paint a picture, it could be perfectly a picture. And then we come to the next stage, which is talking about exhibition space. So from Liu's diary, I'm quoting, Ho wants to find a residence or primary school and allow my works to dissolve into the lives and locals. But the space could not be found in Urumqi. The safety of the exhibition and people, visitors, was the primary point of the consideration. And finally, they found space 108, which you can see from the left of the picture. And Liu thinks it allows the space to talk. And also this is a whole idea to put the only four paintings in this empty space. So it creates kind of atmosphere when you're looking through the paintings, and compare with the exhibition space in Urumqi, and also the second part of the exhibition, which is held in Beijing's Today's Museum. Although today's museum have more paintings of photographers or even have a documentary, have filmed, but I do think that in the first one, it looks better. Let's say the exhibition space suits better the topic. Besides, Xinjiang Research Project also is part of the exhibition and led by the coordinator Oning. In this symposium, 3 Han majorities, 1 Kazakh and 2 weavers, giving attempt to cultural perspectives like novel, music, and etc., have been participated inside this topic, let's say, in the discourse of the communication. But unfortunately, all shows an obvious sign of knowledge and professional lacking within the topics. But I think it's a nice try and nice attempt. So we go to the next region, which we are talking about Tibet. And this is a volume called 4 Seasons from 1996 to 2004 from Lunan. Lunan, who was born in 1962 in Beijing, is the only signed Macdon Chinese photographer. And 4 Seasons is a final part of Lunan's trilogy. After the Forgotten People, 1989 to 1990, if anyone knows, that is illustrated the extreme harsh living condition of Chinese psychiatric patients and also the detailed records of the Catholic community on the road, 1992 and 1996. This we are going to talk about later, okay? So the Tibet, when we talk about Tibet, is always appear to be an inspirational place with a holy light. But the real life of Tibetan people is barely unknown. And as you can see here, so basically his works, when I asked about him, how he made these works, he said when he get to a place, he first buy a provincial map and he used a scale to calculate the map. The place that he could find more than 6 villages in the map within 2.5 hours working speed. That means no less than 7.2 kilometers per hour. So from the south village of Lhasa, Chongjie, then slowly move to the west, following the latitude and longitude of the map. Finally located 4 other villages in the small square of the shape, Lamei, Dingjie, Anren, and Dingrui. All these locations are close to the border of Nepal and Bhutan. And as you can see here, well, I just put 3 pictures because we have to go fast, around 2000. And the evidence shows that in the deep Tibetan areas, that's still very basic, or let's say primitive stage. Tourist cities such as Lhasa, we just, I think we all know, is a kind of a special case of the really high economic development. And the vast majority of Tibetans are lived in isolation without outside communication, because when Lu wants to, take photographers with them, he has to first learn Tibetan in order to communicate with them, because they don't speak Mandarin. Although this, let's say, in general, this volume shows a selfish attitude towards focusing, working, Thanksgiving, and enjoyment of living, despite that there were many crucial realities such as living, education, economic conditions in Tibet was not presented. So then we ask ourselves, is the truth of the faith, or due to the ignorance and lacking of the education and economic condition? So it raises a question that after the capitalism and consumerism enters, when, let's say, the Pandora's box is opened, will the life in Tibetan still like this? Is the Tibet still the land of the, the holy land in people's hearts? So it's a good question to ask. And then we go to the second part, as we analyzed in the very beginning: invisible borders, localization from the foreign impacts. We're going to talk about Hong Kong, economic and popular culture levels, which is, we're going to analyze an exhibition called Hong Kong, etc. in 1997, curated by Hou Hanru. As Hong Kong is a city that has a colonial past and now is a special administrative region, greatly influenced by the British impacts in China. At the second, we're going to talk about Catholicism, which is on the religion level. And we are going to talk about on the road, I mentioned before, Catholicism in China in 1992 to 1996 by Lunan. So it's a foreign religion that's scattered throughout and localized in the country. So it's not just in one region, but it's in many, many, many different provinces and regions. So we can first go through Hong Kong. The exhibition, Hong Kong, etc., curated by Ho was a part of the second Johannesburg Biennale under the umbrella of the same trade routes, history, and geography from the artistic director Okwe in Windsor. So I'm going to go through these pictures quite fast. So this is one of the few contemporary international contemporary art exhibitions, perhaps the only one in record to discuss the opportunities and the struggles in relation to Hong Kong handover in 1997. So in this exhibition, Ho tries to discuss about hybridity, which is mixed blood, or let's say mixed cultures. He thinks that Johannesburg and Hong Kong could be a new cosmopolitan city that's in the global stage, you know, with a mixed blood and mixed cultures, people living there are mixed identities and so on. And he thinks that Hong Kong in 1997 was a symbol and an inspiration, not only for the Chinese people, but also for the rest of the world. It's a new format of economic and political organization, as well as an example regarding open possibilities for the future. And the most interesting part of this exhibition is the open blog session. It's a cyberplace, the internet. It's quite thought-provoking. Consider that in 1997 in Africa, that not a lot of people, maybe just a few have a computer or can access internet. But it's a nice, let's say try, perhaps the first one in the biennales that involved internet, because at that time, who thinks that internet is a free space to spread the thoughts and doing communication. So in this blog, questions like, quote, what the handover of Hong Kong in July 1997 signify to you? Do you feel it concerns your own life? What is a global city today? Do you think Hong Kong is such a city? Why? What kind of economic and political system you consider relevant a city like Hong Kong? What kind of culture, identity, creation do you think consider relevant in a city like Hong Kong? I think it's very interesting, and then the blog had a lot of replies, but unfortunately, because many years passed, we can only see a website without the previously record. But I do want to know, if I have a chance, what people wrote there in 1997, and consider what happened today, what happened to the Facebook, what happened to internet, what happened to this information online and the communication. Is quite ironic compared to what happened now. And we go to the last part, which is catalytism in China. First, we go through the historical concept. I put a map here, is a map from Zhenghe in Ming Dynasty, but actually when catalytism has connections with China is in Yuan Dynasty, which is before Ming Dynasty. I'll give you a roughly time is from 1271 to 1368. And as you can say, Zhenghe already knows more or less, maybe not very accurate, but you know, like the general shape of the world. And also they start to have a very close communication with the outside world. And here I'm quoting Bishop Constantini, who was the very first bishop that Vatican City sent to China, and also did a lot of education for the Chinese bishops and priests in the very beginning. So what he says is, quoting, the mission area can be compared to the flowers in the greenhouse. If you want to grow strong, you have to transplant it to the ground to be deeply rooted, because the flowers in the greenhouse cannot resist the ravages of the wind and rain. So here he is talking about the localization of a foreign religion in China. We can say here what Li Nan has taken the photographs from 1992. He actually took 4 years that he has taken photos across the 10 provinces, include Shanxi, Shandong, Inner Mongolia, Yunnan, Hubei, Gansu, Shanxi, Guangxi, Tibet, and Jiangsu. So it's a split throughout the country rather than focus on one region. You can see here, for example, in the photographs, It's a cross, it's a very westernized cross, actually built it on the traditional Chinese roof. And the children's sing songs led by a Chinese very young man. And here, which I think is very interesting, an old couple sitting at home, and they actually hang Jesus Christ and Maria together with smile on the wall. So it's a perfect combination of the, let's say, localization of the foreign culture. And then in the confession in 1992, and you can see people here, although they didn't have the condition of the church, but they go to pray with the priest that's sitting on a chair, but using a scarf to cover their face. And then here, which I think is very important, because two women of the male ethnicity are in Yunnan, basically, but they have their own religion, which is a shamanism, but they do believe in Catholicism in this photograph. If it's not Yunnan, I wouldn't know. But as you can see, although they were dressing like believed in shamanism, they're in their traditional dresses, but they do pray under the cross. And the last one is saying mass at home, a very poor house with, like a wallpaper like newspapers, and the priest is doing a mass, and the table, or let's say the platform of the ceremony, is actually their bed and their dining table, and the people are just there to pray, and it's very strong visual image. Just like I said very beginning, you get a lot of information rather than you read one page of the book. So we have to go very fast and grab very facial parts of this topic. We talked about margins, but there is also the core, let's say the central issue. And I hope to explain in the future conference the interaction relationships with the center, because they're actually influence each other, and actually they're reacted to each other. And I hope to leave an open door and continue to explore in the concepts in the future. I think in autumn, hopefully, I'm going to publish a book co-authored with Tom as well, the professor of Blanquerna as well. It's called China Today, Minorities, Culture and Society. And hopefully, if everything goes well, I hope see you all in the book launch. And thank you very much. And this is my email. And if you have any questions, you can email me. And this is my website if you want to know what I wrote before and what I have done the projects. Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Mei. It was wonderful to listen to you, all your explanations. Empezamos ahora el pequeño espacio que tenemos de preguntas, de comentarios. Si hay alguna persona que quiera añadir alguna cosa, hacer algún comentario en las presentaciones que hemos tenido en nuestra segunda parte.
I have a question.
Okay.
I have a question to you, to Laia. Because I feel very interested by your presentation, and it is, for me, is a very knowledge for as well. And when I read through the presentation, I was thinking about alienation of the Chinese or African contemporary arts in the West. This concept is actually super important. But for example, in the recent years, I'm not talking about like in 1990 something, and Xi Yanjun and his partners' works is still continuously repeating the same, more or less the same style like before, but with the time already difference. So there are quite a lot of art critics that in China was asking if there are overemphasizing the alienization of the Chinese contemporary art in the global context, because some of the let's say scholars, academics, and art critics or artists even, they think that the good art should be even, or is not over exaggerated, or is not overemphasized, because now the time and period are already different. So I want to ask you, what do you think about this discourse?
Es muy interesante lo que mencionas, porque justamente si te fijas, las primeras obras son del 99, la última que hemos visto era del 2012-13, que es un periodo largo donde hay estas series, ¿no? Donde estos cuerpos bárbaros, estos aliens, ¿no? Y ellos juegan evidentemente con esta idea del nosotros y los otros, y lo reproducen y lo enmarcan. Otra cuestión es si verdaderamente en la actualidad continúa habiendo, ¿no?, esta relación dicotómica o no. Quizás yo creo que las últimas obras se están distanciando de esta dinámica que era tan pautada en las primeras obras, que de una manera más clara, quizás en un primer momento en los 90, principios de los 2000, hasta el 2012 que tenemos Scream, pero Scream, fíjate que ya es diferente de cuando irrumpían saltando en la cama de Tracy Emin o se meaban directamente en el urinario de Duchamp, con lo cual sí que creo que hay una evolución en su trabajo. Otra cuestión es la recepción, como muy bien indicas, si es necesario ir continuando con estas ideas o no. En todo caso, como hemos mencionado al inicio de la sesión, creo que se está trascendiendo esta imagen dicotómica, pero por ejemplo con la pandemia del COVID se ha ido en la narrativa hacia, ¿no?, otros contextos, se ha ido pasos para atrás y hay otra vez, ¿no?, esta idea del peligro amarillo, ¿no?, malentendido, y esta mirada al otro que se ha estado potenciando. Y por ejemplo en el contexto español, el artista puto chino maricón desde Madrid, ¿no?, pues salía en una desfilada de moda con el torso, ¿no?, en Notavirus, ¿no?, como muchas otras personas, también haciendo hincapié de qué está pasando, ¿no? Yo creo que sí que hay momentos de inflexión en este proceso de diálogo transcultural, pero creo que aún hay mucho trabajo que hacer. Otra cuestión que es que les interese a ellos, como estrategia, esta idea del otro, de lo exótico, el auto-orientalismo, quizás más en las últimas obras que no en las primeras, pero es muy importante esta conciencia de explotar lo otro o el auto-orientalismo también para entrar, y ellos juegan con los medios de comunicación también para tener una visibilidad, forman parte de su obra. Y hay muchos historiadores o curadores que también mencionan, ¿no?, si a veces entras dentro de la institución, ¿se está neutralizando tu mensaje o no se está neutralizando tu mensaje? Muchas personas dicen que a pesar de que igual al jugar con la institución y tópicos estés, ¿no?, dentro de este marco, ¿no?, que puede ser lo que se espera, también es una manera de introducir estos temas en espacios que quizás no se hablaría de ellos.
Okay, thank you.
¿Tenéis más preguntas, comentarios? Mira, Joaquín se sube allá porque yo no oigo los que hablan en la sala porque estoy en este pequeño despachito. Escuchamos. ¿Alguien tomaba la palabra?
Hay una pregunta, perdón.
¿Sí?
Habla, Joaquín, te escuchamos.
Sí, puedo, ¿se oye?
Sí, adelante.
Vale, no, gracias a las tres por vuestras presentaciones. Yo quería hacer unas preguntas muy concretas a las tres, ¿no? Las lanzo y luego respondéis y ya. A ver, te quería preguntar, Chen Binghui, el colectivo Big Tail Elephant,
Sí.
no ha tenido, nos has contado el contexto, ¿no?, cómo surge, sus primeras obras. ¿No se ha recuperado más recientemente alguna exposición de ellos o ha habido algún homenaje a ellos? Porque lo que nos has contado está un poco limitado a su primera fase de trabajo.
Sí.
Es decir, ¿qué vida ha habido después de esta irrupción, ¿no? Y luego me ha resultado, cuando has puesto los 4 que forman el colectivo, 2 mueren en el año 2016. Si podrías contar algo, porque también es curioso que coincida que mueren los 2 en el 2016. ¿Y cuál es actualmente, qué queda de bueno, de este grupo. Bueno, sí. La historia está clara, nos las has contado, ¿no? Pero eso sí ha habido algo como más recientemente y si puedes contar un poco sobre la muerte. Esta es una pregunta. A Laia sobre el colectivo, bueno, es una pareja artística, en este caso Marforría, también nos has contado su trabajo en el Reino Unido, en un periodo de tiempo relativamente largo, pero ¿qué pasa con ellos? ¿Siguen trabajando? ¿Se ha acabado ya su trabajo con esta reflexión sobre el otro, el bárbaro, ¿no? Que lo hacen de muchos modos, ¿no? Como nos has contado? Pero ya está, han cerrado esa fase, continúan trabajando juntos, ya no trabajan juntos. Su reflexión ahora sigue recurriendo a esta idea, ¿no? Sobre la que bueno, se han extendido largamente, etcétera, etcétera. Y luego ya para Mei Huang, ya lo último es, claro, el título de la ponencia, que es sobre la homogeneización del margen, algo así era, ¿no? Yo lo que me ha quedado, que me gustaría si pudieras aclarar, es los artistas que hemos visto son artistas que forman parte de la minoría, de las minorías, es decir, la foto de los miao o de los católicos, quien hace esas fotos es un católico. Las fotos que hemos visto de Tíbet, quien hace esas fotos es un tibetano, etcétera, etcétera. Las fotos que hemos visto del delta del río de las Perlas, de Hong Kong, las hace un hongkonés que forma parte de esa clase social que queda ahí representada, o no, o son artistas Han que van a Tíbet, van a visitar católicos, van a Hong Kong y hacen fotos de márgenes, bueno, vale, fronteras étnicas, etcétera, etcétera. Bueno, simplemente es esta cuestión, ¿no? Es decir, ¿quién es el agente, ¿no? ¿Quién produce esas obras de arte que tratan sobre los márgenes? ¿Salen del mismo margen o salen de fuera y se acercan al margen? Simplemente esto. Gracias.
Gracias.
Pues voy a contestar primero.
Sí, contesta.
Pues con respecto al año que mueren los dos artistas, uno en realidad es 2016 y otro es 2016, no son mismos. Pero
lo he visto.
Ajá, sí, y no tiene una razón específica, sino solo por su enfermedad. Y los dos se mueren por enfermedad y sí que muere muy temprano. Y en realidad estas cuatro artistas, después de entrar en las exposiciones internacionales y durante este proceso de entrar en el ciclo de esfera más internacional o occidental, en realidad no solo este grupo, en realidad, a partir de 1997, más o menos muchos artistas chinos también va participando en muchas ocasiones las exposiciones internacionales y sobre todo me parece un fenómeno, un punto muy interesante que es que estos grupos van disolviendo en este proceso y no es muy natural y no es como no es que vamos a disolver, no, sino es que ellos van creando las obras individualmente. Y porque antes que la razón de formar el colectivo principalmente es porque quería evitar asumir las responsabilidades de política o cierta riesgo que se puede evitar si cuando a celebrar las exposiciones underground. En este caso, pues me parece es un punto que quería destacar, ¿no? Y también en 2015 también había una exposición muy grande de retrospectiva en Beijing. Sí, también me has enviado un póster que es una exposición retrospectiva de este grupo. Y principalmente recoge casi todas las obras de ellos. Y también un punto muy interesante es que, porque en aquella época es muy difícil a documentar o hacer fotos de muchas performances, o que faltan muchas documentaciones en situ. Y en este caso, ya que en la década 90 y por todo el tema de restricción, underground y clandestino, pues los artistas normalmente pueden obtener cómo hacer fotos entre ellos, es que normalmente son sus amigos. Y en este grupo, pues, un artista que se llama Binghui, que él es un trabajador, no es artista profesional, es un trabajador en la estación de televisión. En este caso puede tener muchos recursos, ¿no? Como por ejemplo cámara o los recursos, ¿no? Y también ayuda mucho a la organización, como por ejemplo iluminación de la exposición o muchas instalaciones. Y también hace fotos a documentar eso. Y esto ayuda mucho a organizar esta exposición retrospectiva en 2015. Y eso también es un punto muy interesante. Sí.
Hay una pregunta en el chat también a Binghui en relación a las obras performativas que nos hacen a mí y a ti del arte performativo como arte rebelde, de cambio, de movimiento, de sociedad, tangible y volátil. ¿Cómo, viendo las obras y acciones mostradas por las dos ponentes, se produce hoy este arte? ¿Cómo se contextualizan? ¿Cuál es el papel de las instituciones? ¿Seguimos sin sitios performativos? Yo solamente decir brevemente, Binghui, si quieres luego añades lo que consideres, que generalmente las prácticas performativas siempre tienen menos espacios de visibilidad, sea en China, sea en España, sea en Reino Unido. En muchas ocasiones son los festivales de performance las que acogen encuentros donde pueden los diferentes performance mostrar lo que hacen. En muchas ocasiones también lo que hacen es ocupar directamente el espacio público, o ya sea en el colectivo Mad for Real o como mencionaba Binghui con Big Tail Elephant, que en espacios clandestinos, sus casas, espacios ocupados directamente en la calle, y luego en muchas ocasiones también entra la institución que invita al artista conceptual o al performer para que haga una propuesta, pero evidentemente siempre hay una dificultad añadida cuando estamos hablando de lenguaje performativo en relación a cómo se entra, cómo se dialoga en los marcos institucionales que siempre privilegian otros lenguajes. No sé si querías añadir algo en esta pregunta concreta, Binghui.
Pues yo creo que el papel de las instituciones, sobre todo en la década de 90, pues prácticamente era muy difícil entrar en las instituciones, sobre todo para las artes experimentales, las artes underground, porque simplemente en las instituciones solo aceptaba las artes de estilo realismo socialista, ¿no? Pero es muy curioso que después de muchos artistas que entraron en la esfera internacional, y la institución china vuelve a aceptar las artes que anteriormente era anoficial, y ahora vuelve a entrar en la institución, como por ejemplo Peter Elephant también es un buen ejemplo, ¿no? Y también las obras de Binghui Zheng, que antes incluso no se podía organizar organizaciones, y después de entrar en la esfera internacional primer paso es hacer exposiciones en Suiza, en Europa, en Estados Unidos, y después vuelve a entrar en las instituciones chinas. Y eso es muy interesante, ¿no? Y ¿qué pasa? Que durante ese proceso de pasar de ser arte oficial, y sí.
Si os parece bien, yo responderé muy brevemente a la pregunta de Joaquín y luego te doy paso a ti, Mei. Y ya no haremos pausa porque a las 3 entra la doctora Koch para mantenernos en el timing. Preguntabas, Joaquín, en relación si Mad for Real continúan, ¿no?, trabajando. Ellos continúan activos como pareja artística. Quizás no están trabajando con la intensidad de hace unos años, pero continúan en sus diferentes proyectos. Yo en la presentación de hoy también tenéis que pensar que he hecho una selección de obras en relación a la propuesta, al discurso que os presentaba, pero evidentemente su trabajo es más amplio y no únicamente trabaja en este tema, todo y que sí que se tiene que decir que es uno de los main topics de su praxis artística, esta relación de cuerpos bárbaros en este contexto y cómo lo van desarrollando luego la relación con las obras de arte canónicas euroamericanas, lo van desarrollando, pero no es lo único que desarrollan y continúan en activo y tienen una página web por si queréis tener más información que creo que puede ser muy útil. Adelante, Mei.
Okay, so I'm going to answer very fast according to the selection of the artists and why I pick up the artists according to the, let's say, ethnicity. Firstly, in this presentation, actually, I select quite, it's a mixture. It's a mixture of artists and the curator because Chang'e, he is an ethnicity artist, the Mongol artist was born in Inner Mongolia, and all his works actually, and he's also a curator. He has a space, you know. He is trying to promote as well the Mongol culture and the cultural diversity and so on. So actually in the part of research I didn't present here, there are still a lot of different projects he's promoting, and also the artist he invited in his show that to talk about the relationship between like the people from Inner Mongolia, the ethnic Mongol artist with Han people, and also with a Mongol artist who is from Mongolia. And then in the second part, that Lunan, although he is a Han, he's from Han region, but he went into Tibet and spent like 4 years perhaps to get inside the life with the community, and also from the Catholicism volume that he also been there and get into the community to take these photos. From the in-depth interview that I did from him, that also you can find in the book when it's released. There are many stories, and there is a lot of what happened with them, and also the feedbacks and the field research from those people, actually local people or people who has the religion that give the feedbacks and so on. And from the Hong Kong part, that in the show Hong Kong, etc., in 1997, there are international artists, there are Hong Kong artists and Chinese mainland artists. I think it shows a dynamic relationship, and also it kind of showed communication and also the situation, the current discourse, let's say, in the 1997, and also in the book and the part of the research, and also includes many young Chinese and mainland Chinese and also Hong Kong young artists to have their works inside to talk about this topic. Because our presentation is very short, so I can only present these 3 people there, but there are more. Yeah, that's it.
Thanks so much, Mei. It was really interesting to listen to you this morning.
Thank you.
If you don't have more questions, more comments, I think that we can just present Dr. Koch. It's 2 minutes for 1, but I think that it's good if we start on time. I think that she arrived already. She's with us. She's with us, I think. Yes. Okay. I will make the presentation if it's okay. Of Franziska Koch. We are so happy to have with us the Dr. Koch. She's a postdoctoral researcher and assistant professor of global art history in Heidelberg University at the Heidelberg Center for Transcultural Studies. and she's a co-editor of the anthology Negotiation Difference, Contemporary Chinese Art in the Global Context, and the author of several papers, and she realized a lot of conferences in relation of Chinese contemporary art and transcultural studies. As well, she co-founded both the Research Network for Modern and Contemporary Chinese Art and the Research Network for Transcultural Practices in the Arts and Humanities. And her teaching and research interests include art histories in plural, and historiographies in transcultural perspective, modern and contemporary artistic enlargements, transfers, and transnational processes between East Asia, Europe, North America, exhibition studies, the colonial theory, and so on. It's a person that is working in different issues, and for us it's a really good opportunity to listen her experience, to listen her voice, and to learn more about her research. Thanks so much, Franziska, to be with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for this very kind introduction. I'm sorry I wasn't able to unmute myself and to show my video just for some seconds. So now Lydia has saved me and solved the problem.
Fantastic.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, and Laia, for this kind introduction and having me here, which is a virtual reality. Also, I hope my talk in the next 60 minutes, even though it's not live on site, which I would love to be in Barcelona, but I'm located in my home office in Stuttgart, safely tied to a very high incidence environment at the moment. Yeah, so I hope it won't be too virtual and rather visually entertaining. And I brought a video clip for you as well, and tried to make the best of my transcultural approach to discussing the concept of the avant-garde. Yeah, and let me just share my screen. Sorry, I hope it's, yeah, here. Can you see it now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, fine. So I'll just start without any further ado. And yeah, I would be more than happy to answer all your questions, and you can post them in the chat, or as I don't know how it will work on site, but I'm sure that Laia will moderate it. And I'm really looking forward for your questions. So let's start and see what you will make out of my talk. Let me move my screen a little bit so that I can better switch the pages. So, okay. So, what you see here is an outline of my talk that falls into 3 parts. In the first, I will summarize a text by the Japanese scholar Shigemi Inaga, who posed a critical question regarding the relevance and problem of the concept of the avant-garde when it comes to practices outside the West. So that is Europe and North America, basically. In the second part, I will introduce and discuss an equally critical but very recent artistic dealing with the same question, Kent Monkman's film Casualties of Modernity from 2015. Only in the third part then will I turn to an early vanguard artist group, the Stars, Xing Xing, operating in China at the beginning of the Open Door period after the Cultural Revolution. Taking this very bold stretch that frames the late 1970s in China by means of a Japanese scholar writing in the midst of the so-called global turn in the 1988, but in resonance with an artistic position by a contemporary artist with indigenous roots in Canada, I hope to at least hint at the historical complexities and cultural entanglements which we need to address when looking at art history in a global way. Now, let me start. By referring to a seminal text of Japanese comparative literature scholar Shigemi Inaga, who in 1988 posed the pertinent question, does the avant-garde exist in the Third World? Provoked by the exhibition Le Japon des avant-gardes that had taken place in the Centre Pompidou in Paris 2 years earlier and was followed by a very critical debate among experts of Japanese art history. I'd like to use his still provocative arguments to introduce you to lingering methodological problems when addressing historical and more recent vanguard artistic practices in East Asia, among them the emergence of the so-called Chinese avant-garde since the late 1970s. So here we see the outline of Inaga's proposition in a 6-page long, highly condensed and still very concise critique of the avant-garde as a concept that has been uncritically applied to discuss and dismiss non-Western practices. I show you this argumentative outline as reflected in the subchapters of his text. Reading Inaga discussing, quote unquote, a borderline case of misunderstanding in aesthetic intercultural exchange, I found it sobering to see that already in 1988, he pointed back to the end of the 1970s as a time in which discussions of what was then still called intercultural dialogue were prominent. He responded with what we might today rather call a transcultural reflection of the avant-garde conundrum with a specific focus on Japan. In his avant-propos, he made clear that his observations and claims hold true for all societies in East Asia, as well as far beyond this regional context, given that it is, I quote, logically impossible to find an authentically avant-gardist position within third world culture, end of quote. Summarizing his keen observations and the ambiguity of the Japanese avant-garde that emerged in contact with modern European avant-gardes, such as Cubism and Fauvism, he identifies 2 reasons for the claim. First, the notion of the avant-garde being constituted by a Eurocentric point of view. And second, the fact that the avant-garde is a colonial product. And I read the quote for you, and you can also read it on screen. Not by accident did the avant-garde come into its own during the colonial period. He's referring to European avant-gardes. The appropriation of the other by a Western Europe, hoping thereby to regenerate its own traditions, attains at this point its ultimate manifestation and brings with it an inevitable identity crisis within Western Europe itself. Sorry. That which is considered traditional in a non-Western context becomes avant-garde as it is integrated into a Western context. But this transplantation is a one-way dispossession. For non-Western culture, this represents a double alienation. Non-Western culture provides the Western avant-garde with an alibi, but in so doing, the non-Western avant-garde is uprooted and is capable of basing itself upon its own culture only through reference to the Western avant-garde. From this indirect means, moreover, can only result an Eastern arrière-garde. So it's a kind of a double alienation that leads to a dichotomy between stipulating the West, and the West stipulates that it's itself by itself, saying we are avant-garde, and the rest is the rest and can only be judged as more vanguard when it catches up with whatever the West does in terms of modernism. Describing the resulting blind spot and 3 consequences for the case of Japan, Inaga examines a mechanism that we do indeed see when looking into the histories of other non-Western avant-gardes as well. So I quote him again. On the one hand, that which is identifiable in Japan as avant-garde through its formal resemblance with the West's example is by definition an epigone of Europe, because it's like modeled after Europe, so it's only derivative. On the other hand, that which does not fit in the latter's déjà vu category is automatically subsumed into tradition. So it doesn't count as contemporary, modern, forward, authentic, progress-oriented art. Thus, the conception of a non-Western avant-garde becomes, quote unquote, doubly impossible. I've highlighted this again in red. And I think sorry. I sent Laia the text by Inaga, so you are welcome to read it up after the lecture and engage probably with it a little in more depth. Inaga briefly outlines 3 artistic practices in Japan that suffered from this epistemic violence. First, the case of the Nihonga painting genre, which he translates as, and I've marked it here in bold, which he translates as national painting. While today it's translated rather as Japanese painting. It is a painting genre that developed during Japan's last dynasty, the Meiji era, in response to the introduction of Western oil painting. While it actually meant rather radically modernizing the long-standing painting tradition in Japan, it stuck to traditional means, materials such as ink and pigments on paper and silk. Further, it's strongly associated with an emergent national discourse trying to define a cultural identity that would not mean wholesale westernization. Since this meant formally resembling quote-unquote tradition and at the same time representing modern national aspirations, i.e. a break with the past, with the imperial past of Japan, the Western definition of avant-garde as radically breaking with tradition and as opposing academism and other strongly nationally configured styles wouldn't apply. Ultimately, this consequence points us to a very basic problem of communication and translation, which Inaga stresses in several key passages of his text. I quote him again. Here, the effort at communication cuts both ways. No such ambiguity between modern and traditional exists in the Japanese term Nihonga, which on the other hand is meaningless for foreigners. So leaving Nihonga as the genre designation without translating it would make it a euphemism reserved for specialists. Yet this is very much what specialists actually do till today. So often you hear specialists of Japanese art rather using the term Nihonga than translating it as either national painting or traditional painting. Yet, once paraphrased, the term engenders inevitable confusion, and that's his claim. Explanation leads to deviation, and I want you to have that very strong claim to keep it in mind for our discussion, because you can also debate that. So the diptych that I show you here, and I hope, can you see the whole screen? Because I see the tiles on the bottom, so I'm a little bit irritating, but I hope, oh, sorry. I hope that for you, you see the whole picture. Tell me if not, right? The diptych that, okay, that's great, thank you. That I show you here to exemplary illustrate Nihonga is a very charged one, hinting at further inner Asian complications, because it is the work of a Korean painter, not a Japanese one, and it's produced just 1 year before the end of Japan's colonial rule over Korea, which you surely know was also a very violent period for Korea. This is to say, once we look into trans-regional or inter-regional connections and developments, and not only into the relation between the West and the rest, or Asia and Europe, or divisions along colonized and colonizing countries, the entangled histories that actually inform the multiplicities of thinking and practice, not only in Asia, become evident. I hope we might have later time to discuss this a bit. Now, Inaga's third case strongly resonates with other avant-garde practices in the Third World, as well as in countries of the former Eastern Bloc. It concerns Japanese as well as Western attempts of representing, I quote, the Japan of the avant-gardes. Inaga describes the basic problem of its art historical categorization as follows. By means of a logic of things, one first discerns the counterpart of Western avant-gardes in works made in Japan. Next, these counterparts are examined for specifically Japanese traits, a very odd reversal in that this approach tries after the event to find Japanese specificity that had been systematically eliminated during the establishment of the corpus in question. So the irony is that anyone doing so must seek out typically Japanese traits in artistic efforts which had the specific intention of doing away with their Japanese nationality. Indeed, the dream of the Japanese avant-gardes between the wars was one of unconditional identification with European avant-gardes. So you see that also this other category, not the Nihonga, but the Japan of the avant-gardes, poses a real problem. So this, sorry, I go, yeah, it's fine. This observation, I argue, at least partially fits the case of the so-called Chinese avant-garde of the post-Mao era as well. I will come to that in some minutes. And I show you this example of the Japan of the avant-garde, since it hints at later transculturally perspectivized studies. Where do we have it here? that help to substantiate Inaga's observation to some extent, while constructively exploring and mediating the epistemological differences and translational problems with the avant-garde in Japan, on which Inaga so strongly insists. Interestingly, he concludes his text pleading for, I quote, an unmaintainable mission of tolerance that art historians as well as artists would need to uphold when trying to translate and exhibit Japanese practices to a Western audience. So I quote him a final time. Let's go back. No, guess no. Here. No effort at presenting Japan to a foreign audience can be realized without this kind of trauma. Uprooted from the Japanese cultural soil, the position of informants, i.e. Japanese artists, art historians organizing exhibitions for or in the West, far removed from Japan, confers upon them the role of representatives. Theirs is a mission placed under the sign of negation, since they will only accomplish it insofar as they are detached from what they seek to represent. Only through suffering the stigma of transgression can we reach the goal we have set ourselves. Yet this wound alone constitutes the cause and effect of Japan's power to fascinate as a fictive or just a side of unknowability. We are incapable of crossing this threshold of intelligibility, this epistemological border. What we can communicate and transmit is limited to truth wounded by symbolic violence. But does not the intellectual task before us consist rather in constantly representing this wound? Instead of arrogantly claiming to be truth keepers? End of quote. So there you have a very pertinent question. And although I think we need to question Inaga's strategy to essentialize intelligibility or unknowability in what he calls aesthetic intercultural exchange, his radical ethical question presents us with food for thought that still seems very relevant today. So I basically think that more than 3 decades later, the discourse and curatorial practices have moved on from Inaga's position and found transcultural approaches that exactly focus on the complex translations that artists in Japan and elsewhere undertook when negotiating modernism and claiming vanguard stances in response as well as in defiance of European classical avant-gardes. So rather than to shroud Japanese artists in intelligibility, these approaches trace and explain the quote-unquote micro-histories of an eccentric modernity, as one exhibition at the Kunstsammlung Nordrhein-Westfalen in West Germany was called in 2019. And here, the chair of global art history, Professor Juneja, my colleague here in Heidelberg, she was the co-advisor. And you can see that academic discourse thus entangles and actively engages with the latest museological approaches to solve the question how to tell these entangled modernisms, sometimes also called alternative modernisms, and and here the solution was to really tell microhistories of an eccentric modernity. And so you see here the Japanese avant-garde painter Yorosu Tetsugoro, who painted Nude Beauty in 1912. And you also see that this very large-scale oil painting was then juxtaposed to another nude painting by the expressionist German painter, I think it's Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, who also fancied primitivism as a form of his then vanguard stance. And if you like to read more and a very detailed microhistory and a case study that is brilliantly written, that introduces us to the question of this pursuit of universalism as realized by the painter Yorosu Tetsugoro and the Japanese modern art, please really grab hold of this brilliant book of Alicia Falk, an American-based scholar, I guess, who tells you how, and here we see a self-portrait presumably done in graphite or charcoal, where Tetsugoro obviously also refers to Vincent van Gogh a little bit. So you can see there was a very active negotiation, and we can question with this later transcultural approach a little bit the essentialism that we can still feel see in Inaga's strong stance, who insists on unintelligibility and in explanation leads to deviation, while probably today we would rather go with what my two close colleagues and collaborators, Ming Tianpo and Birgit Hopfner, have outlined in a concept for an international academy, where they say that acknowledging art's world-making capacities is echoed by recent studies in global art history, which call for a fundamental paradigm shift beyond a neoliberal conception of the global as an expansive network of culture and capital that starts from a colonial center and disperses to its peripheries. Such binary models fail to analyze the complex power and knowledge structures of the world. Worlding, a concept rooted in phenomenological thinking, is understood as a decolonial tactic that enacts openings of time and consciousness to other values and multiple modes of being. And they close with a reference to the work of Heidelberg's professor of global art history, as I said, Monica Juneja, who stresses, I quote her, that the necessary work of a global art history is that of decolonization, understood as a multi-sided and collaborative engagement with entangled histories, epistemologies, power structures, migrations, culture, and capital, that involves critically examining how particular concepts, practices and knowledge of art making shape our understanding and being in the world, end of quote. So this is still rather broad sketch and very probably new or abstract to you as a form of approach, but I hope it will become a little bit clearer when I now turn to Kent Monkman's approach that struck me as a highly conscious form of worlding of the global and the European avant-garde concept in particular. Acutely aware of the fact that indigenous perspectives form the unintelligible flip side of the settler colonially constituted art history of Canada, Monkman offers an artistic solution to the problem of the avant-garde's incommensurability that strongly resonates with Inaga, in that both stress the crucial ethics of art practices and historiographies in a global context. So for that, I beg for a little bit of patience because I need to now stop sharing this and share another, sorry. So let me share this. And please remind me if I forget to switch on my microphone afterwards.
Perfect, we see it.
Okay. Can you also hear it?
Yes.
Yes, perfect.
Is receiving an official visit from Miss Chief Eagle Testicle today. Reaffirming her commitment to the less fortunate, the celebrity artist, aristocratic socialite, and patron of the arts.
I've heard she's foxy.
As if I'm not busy enough already.
There she is!
Mrs. Chief!
Miss Chief Eagle Testicle, I am the Doctor of Fine Arts. It is a pleasure to host you at the modern wing of our institution.
I'm very pleased to be here, Doctor. I know that I can give love for a minute, for half an hour, for a day, for a month. I can give. I'm very happy to do that, and I want to do that.
Please follow me, Miss Chief. Lots of work to do.
Cameras are not allowed further. Come on, cameras not allowed further. Come on.
Oh dear, I suppose this isn't the best place to begin our rounds. This one needs to be taken to the morgue.
Oh, too bad I missed this one.
This is romanticism, Miss Chief. He was the first casualty of modernity.
Oh.
On the precipice of modernity, he was inspired by two ancient traditions. On one side, by the classical art of ancient Greece, and by the ancient cultures discovered in the New World, savages. Bounded by these two worlds, he straddled a precarious balance between naivety and knowledge.
Oh yes, I know a lot about the romantic savage. Europeans projected their fantasies onto us. But I have to admit, I absolutely thrived on the attention. Oh, how I was the toast of Europe, performing with my mentor and lover, George Catlin, in Paris and in London. But I am still a hopeless romantic. I mean, can you blame me, Doctor? Look at this gorgeous specimen. How sad to see him go. What a waste of a beautiful creature. Oh, Doctor.
Doctor, your next patient is waiting.
Oh, why, yes, of course. Miss Chief, please follow me.
What in heaven's name happened to this poor, poor dear?
This is an acute case of cubism, madam. It began with what appears to be a very serious infection of primitivism.
Sad and cruel fate for the female nude. I remember the rise of the odalisque in the late 18th century. How the magnificent odalisque replaced the gorgeous, feminized male nudes of my colleagues, David and Girodet. First, I wasn't entirely in favor of this, but later, my dear friends Ingres and Manet elevated the female nude to a stardom not seen since antiquity. However, I never could have imagined the female nude would see such a cruel end at the hands of the modern butchers. How dreadfully sad. Are you okay, my dear? You're here for cosmetic reconstruction.
So here I have to brutally stop this very beautiful rendering of Kent Monkman and how he takes care of the modern avant-garde in a very chronological way. So I hope you can hear me speaking again and see the PowerPoint. If not, let me know. So
yes, we saw it. Perfect.
Okay. So and sorry, I was a little bit early of showing the film. I obviously forgot to show you these introductional slides that you see who Kent Monkman is, and he has said in one of his lectures that you can also find on YouTube that there was this moment of enlightenment, so to say, when he realized as a young academically trained painter with Cree ancestors seeking to leave a mark in the long history of painting, that there weren't any indigenous people who could serve as his role models. So since Monkman was also interested in negotiating third sex or so-called two-spirit experiences, he eventually resolved to simply invent a figure that fills and targets the blind spots of the Eurocentric art historical master narrative. So the figure renders very visible the colonial constitution of this master narrative and questions its binary normative binary gender its binary gender norms in a highly ironic manner, as you have just seen. So Monkman calls this female alter ego mischief eagle testicle, a deliberate play with the words mischief and egotistical. Her personality and actions, crossing many media from painting and photography to performances and large-scale installations, incorporate about everything that colonialism has made impossible for First Nation people in North America, when misrepresenting them, covering them up, or writing them out of historical accounts. As you can see here, Monkman decides to repaint colonial history paintings that have glorified Canada as an empty, sublime wilderness, waiting for the white male settler to cultivate, civilize, and Christianize it, by inserting the indigenous figures. So you can see that in the background a little bit. So it's a large-scale landscape painting with horses and wild flora and fauna that you see, and he inserts indigenous figures, so also figures of color, often engaged in homoerotic or other actions that literally queer official accounts and canonical paintings. And as I wanted to show you here in the large-scale painting called The Daddies from 2016, he appropriated the official portrait of the purely white male fathers of Confederation that was executed in 1964 by Rex Woods and hung into one of the federal government's buildings. And this goes back to another painting that only survived, as far as I understood, as a sketch. So this was then reaffirmed in a very authoritative, classical, realist history painting manner in '64, and as late as 2016 he repainted that painting in the moment, the historical moment, and in the middle where there used to be a blank space, he inserts mischief is eagle testicle. So obviously the only semi-female figure in that room, which is also a queer figure, of course, and makes her authoritatively pointing to that moment and acknowledging, so to say, the indigenous presence that has been, and also other minorities' presence that have been written out of that glorious national history. And let me show another very entertaining work that is called Black Bees from 2014, where he emulated a natural science museum's diorama, inserting mischief in an appealing indigenous outfit. You have a photograph of her on the left as well, where, with which she drives on a motorcycle through the plains to stumble across what looks like one of the rarely surviving, or the last surviving bisons, or maybe it's already half dead, I would say, massacred by Pablo Picasso's primitivist cubism. So here you have also a direct reference into the two-dimensionality of that Picasso's nude that we saw just in the modern wing, which could barely breathe, so that you wonder if she might have caught even COVID. Yeah, and you see that you probably know that the dioramas was an invention by Europeans to kind of create immersive environments in which the European white gaze would longingly, desiringly see what actually was thought of extinct creatures, but also extinct and savages and humans that actually fall subject and prey to the European colonialism, and were very much still living and surviving, but barely, and probably waiting outside as beggars on the streets directly next to the museum, but were kind of narrated as being the savages that are now frozen in a pre-modern past, overcome by European civilization, industrialization, modernisms, and so an object of the longing gaze that would project and forever freeze these others in a distant past, right? And so here, Mischief Eagle Testicle is very much alive and thriving, actually really literally thriving on a motorcycle. So she is dominating the whole diorama, and she's with her queerness showing that ostentatiously, and then kind of ironically pointing to the primitivism that has enabled this kind of objectification of the others. So in this award-winning 15 minutes long film called The Casualties of Modernity that we just saw a bit of, like the first few minutes, Monkman cleverly appropriated the soap opera genre and lets Miss Chief Eagle Testicle appear as a kind of Princess Diana-like celebrity on a caretaking mission concerned about the ever-dying core protagonists of the avant-garde, and that's the European avant-garde. Thus, Miss Chief is really rather literally engaged in what Inaga called to constantly represent this wound. Let's see, and you've just seen it, and I think it's a kind of Monkman really manages with a kind of tragically sincere irony to respond to Inaga's plea, researching indigenous as well as two-spirit peoples' untold narratives and unretrievable historical voices in hegemonic Western art historical accounts. So Monkman very lovingly puts the Western avant-garde notion to rest by staking out what I call a strong transcultural position for Miss Chief Eagle Testicle and himself, the soapy clue of Miss Chief's flamboyant visit at the modern wing being her reanimation and escape with romanticism. That's a spoiler now, the quote-unquote first casualty of modernity. And while Inaga in 1988 still stresses a quintessential, inescapable untranslatability of different cultures and epistemologies under a colonially established Western paradigm, Monkman lets Miss Chief literally thrive on real as well as imagined transcultural entanglements, wholeheartedly embracing ambiguity and incommensurabilities. So Casualties of Modernity presents therefore an example for the ongoing appeal that the Western notion of the avant-garde can and will most likely continue to have for contemporary artists, despite and because of its fraud and global colonial underpinnings. So my answer and a little bit a counter argument to Inaga is that this is exactly an ongoing appeal, and that contemporary artists can actually ironically thrive on that moment and put the avant-garde ironically to rest, as here very literally was the case. So let me now very abruptly turn to the third and last part of my lecture. The formation of the so-called Chinese avant-garde after Mao's death and the end of the so-called Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution in 1976, the time Inaga was observing as being characterized by a booming discourse on intercultural exchange, if you remember. Colonial history is not one of our immediate concerns in this case, but half a century of communist rule since the founding of the People's Republic on the 1st of October 1949. One particular culmination of Chinese communism was the Cultural Revolution taking place from 1966 to 76, and I've shown you here what is a print reproduction of a very large-scale authoritative painting that kind of shows the gist of the Cultural Revolution, with a lot of Red Guards streaming to the Tiananmen Square, meeting Chairman Mao, who is given much and rendered much younger and more heroic than he actually was, because it was already his late age. And this, importantly, these kind of paintings, they were mostly not done by one single artist, but by several hands. And often it was claimed that they were consulted by the masses or by amateurs rather than done by professional artists, because that was in line with doing away with any kind of bourgeois educated people and being in a like everyone, even the artists, had to be near to the people, had to be part of the masses. So this was the narrative that framed these also these kind of large-scale socialist realist paintings, and you see all the names of the participating artists given underneath the painting. So as you surely know, the Cultural Revolution was a decade of very severe restrictions for all forms of visual and material culture in China, and only a small range of socialist idioms and practices in direct support of the revolutionary goals of the collectivizing campaign were allowed and engaged many hands, as I just said. Particular for the Cultural Revolution was that eventually all educated people, or the so-called educated people, were, and also the institutions were closed, and academically trained persons targeted as key bourgeois elements, and also not only these persons, but also their children were then persecuted eventually, and they needed to be purged by the young generation, the Red Guards. So they were removed from their state-assigned jobs, forced to admit their crimes in public parades, as you can see on the lower right-hand side of the pictures, and subsequently condemned to labor camps and like low work, like cleaning toilets and these kind of things. And many committed suicide, unable to bear the continuous violent discrimination. So it was not enough to be paraded like discriminated against once, but they were often taken out on the streets again. So this could happen to you anytime and again. So that's why people rather choose to die than to go on enduring that time. Yeah, and as the schools and all the educating institution, university were all closed down, and the Red Guards, young people roamed in the street without anything to do. Eventually, there were like gang fights erupting, and it was very chaotic, so that the People's Army had to rein in the propagandistically radicalized and untrained Red Guards, who were, as I said, massively rallying in the streets. In favor of Great Mao, by sending them to the countryside or into factories in order to learn from the people too. So behind that whole upheaval was actually also a fractal fights within the party leadership. So there were some opposing Mao and trying to gain the power, and by using the Red Guards and proclaiming the mass rallying and collectivizing cultural revolution, Mao was able to get the population behind his back again and still retaining the power. So in my book, Die chinesische Avantgarde und das Dispositiv der Ausstellung, the Chinese Avant-garde and the Dispositif of the exhibition, I examined how the first generation of graduates from the reopened fine arts academies at the end of the 1980s and beginning of the 1990s became framed as the Chinese avant-garde in Western large-scale exhibitions. And although the book is only published in German, I'm sorry, the extended appendix that features over 200 exemplary group exhibition records in a sort of a handbook-like chronological way these exhibitions, and gives you names of curators, dates and places, and number of artists, and who were these artists, so that you can also use it if you're not fluent in German, but you can get the gist of these exhibitions out of the book. So additionally, of course, I have published the analysis of key survey exhibitions in separate English articles that are also available open access or through your libraries, so that I would like to encourage you, if you are curious as to what is the role of the Berlin exhibition China Avant-garde in 1993, or what is the role of a collector's show such as Ma Yong, Contemporary Chinese Art from the SIG collection in Bern in 2005, a part of which I recall has also traveled to Spain. Then you can read this up in separate English articles by me. But now, let me turn to the first large exhibitions organized within China that triggered the international survey exhibition boom. I will take the Beijing-based exhibitions of the amateur artist group called The Stars, Xingxing, as by now canonized example. Its protagonists grew up during the Cultural Revolution and were the first to express and experiment with the relative freedom they enjoyed directly after Deng Xiaoping announced the reform and open door policy in '78. The vanguard artworks are still hard to mediate given the lingering dominance of Western art historical master narratives, combined with the additional problem that many original artworks of this period have not survived, as well as the fact that Chinese museums are still somewhat reluctant to collect and narrate the unofficial positions of that time. In turn, the stars themselves seem to have good reasons not to donate their artistic legacy to state-run museums in mainland China, but to continue taking care of commemorative exhibitions by themselves. It is much to the credit of critically and epistemologically informed transcultural approaches that their work finally receives broad attention in documentary exhibition hosted in corporate or private museums inside the country as well as internationally. So I was very intrigued when a sinology professor of Heidelberg University, the late Rudolf Wagner, showed me this set of 33 black and white photographs in 2012, asking if I could verify and contextualize them as documenting works of the stars, which they do indeed document. While the stars have often been mentioned in the introductory essays of the group exhibitions of modern and contemporary Chinese art that I researched for my dissertation and the book, their original and later works seldom figured in these shows. And you have to think about these photographs as being very small, modest done prints, like photographic prints. So they are really this kind of small photographs, and you can hardly really see anything precise about this, the artworks they actually figure. So they seem to lead the stars' work seem to lead an ominous life as amateur predecessors whose historical achievements fell victim to the fact that their key protagonists had to leave the country shortly after their first successful exhibitions in 1979 and 1980 due to another episode of tightening state control. Overall, their practice consisted of an eclectic mix of stylistic approaches with national as well as international connotations. It was ultimately only coherent and united in the desire to creatively experiment and pave the way for greater freedom of expression. And I've here selected some of these and enlarged them a little bit so that you can see that it has been not only paintings, figurative paintings, or somewhat post-impressionist paintings, but there's also Wang Keping, as by now very famous, acknowledged sculpture with some small-scale wooden sculptures that was included in the stars. And so just to let you know, some of the photographs were also, as you can see here, it's the end of the picture frame, but here it's cut out. So it's not really precise how they render the actual artworks. And some of them, like this and this, it was hard to even find out who's the painter, the artist of these paintings, while the other one, Huang Rei's, Wang Keping's, and Ma Desheng's works are quite renowned and have been identified. And I've published an article where I go into more detail about this stylistic mixture. In its local setting, the characteristic strengths and historic achievement of these works was exactly that the artist did not fear, but deeply enjoyed copying, appropriating, mixing, and changing stylistic elements and motifs rapidly without worrying about previous social context, art historical chronologies, or possible cultural misunderstandings. As founding member Huang Rei put it, we all talked, but not about profound theories because nobody was profound. Everyone was in the learning phase and everyone worshipped the Western masters. As far as art was concerned, we were rebels and hooligans, as they say. While the stars were eager to learn about styles and concepts from abroad, as he said, they were critical about acknowledging Chinese role models, still informed by the Red Guard spirit of rebellion. I quote Huang again. No matter what masters the Chinese seniors, were in their fields, we never had the mindset of followers or worshippers. There are no masters. The only thing that counts is to be true to one's inner calling, to listen to one's inner calling. And this is a very interesting statement because it, on the one hand, shows that exactly this generation of artists was formed as Red Guards. So they were trained as not obeying authority, as only believing in Mao. Now they have become critical of Mao in a way because it also was Mao's fault that they could not enter any fine arts academy or do whatever they would have liked to do as young people longing for formation. But now they turn around this rebellious mindset to rebel against the Chinese conventionalized social realism and looking abroad, looking outside, looking for foreign inspiration, but also being not really discriminating about what they appropriate and how they do it, and being equally radically in experimenting with wildly different styles. So as late as January 2005, Huang pointedly responded to the still lingering question whether the stars, besides their political achievement, were ultimately successful with their aesthetic practice. I quote him again. In an extreme ideological national situation and era, art inevitably faced challenges coming from the absolutism of politics, regardless of whether one employed a strategy of passive avoidance or active confrontation, and that was the position of the stars. One had to raise the status of art itself. Otherwise, the place of art could only be defined by the political situation. At that time, people were encouraged one day to go out and stimulate the economy, so that was the policy of Deng Xiaoping, then punished the next day for violating the moral order, because obviously turning to capitalism also brought some new liberal liberties with it. And so then they were torn in between the officials whether to allow that kind of liberties or not. In the face of such overwhelming political dynamics, the stars maintained their attitude and thus won dignity. This was not politics proper, nor some strange alternative form of politics. This was art, the basic condition and value of the artist, end of quote. So he here makes a very strong point for art being tied to and embedded in a very political situation that is so overbearing that artists on the other side really felt the need to make art their own somewhat semi-political statement, and also claim a room and a space for art that is distanced in a way from proper politics, right? And I now simply flip through some of further examples of the photographic prints that we can discuss if you like and interested. And the reason why I think the stars are indeed a pointed example for methodological problems with the avant-garde term is precisely the tension between their radical vanguard claims and the aesthetic incommensurability with contemporaneous developments in the capitalist West that tends to obscure the long-standing historical entanglements. So, of course, there had been modernism for almost more than 50 years prior to, or no, almost 80 years at that point in time in China. And it's an entangled legacy. And of course, there is an entanglement between socialist realism in China and, let's say, places like Russia, right? That's entangled modern history. But still, the experiments that we see here that were so radical in claiming art to be its own entity and claiming a space for art, and even claiming that doing art is vital to save that post-Mao society, in a way, that's the claim, is totally not really in sync with whatever happened at that time, let's say in Barcelona or in Stuttgart, where you saw very different artistic legacies and painting approaches, right? So it really looks out of sync if you only look on a first glance and compare it under formal aesthetic aspects. And that's the danger. And that's why we need a transcultural approach that places and contextualizes and historicizes the entanglements, and also looks into the artist's stances. So here the outspoken propositions by the artists that I just quoted. The rather loosely organized group, which crystallized mainly around the 3 exhibition instances and consisted of about 24 members, were explicitly claimed very explicitly, they themselves claimed to be an avant-garde in the most radical sense of the word. They attempted to break with the imperative of socialist realism as officially established in the Mao era, and I can show you some more. And they wanted art to turn back to real life and change the society of their days. Last but not least, they were also very conscious of being the first daring to do so, at least in Beijing, and to the extent that they publicly challenged the temporarily disoriented but still authoritative painting party that governed all kinds of artistic production. And they actually risked detention by the police and ultimately the right to exhibit their work. So it was an outspoken critical oppositional take. intervention. In all these aspects, they do indeed meet the influential definition of the critical theorist Peter Bürger's avant-garde definition, and you might look up his seminal book on the theory of the avant-garde, it's called. And Bürger defined the avant-garde as being a self-reflexive and critical move of early 20th century modernist European artists who wanted to break with established aesthetic conventions, that is a temporally framed rupture with the past, but also rejoin art with everyday life, since it had become an autonomous sphere in practice in the sense of l'art pour l'art, thus irrelevant for any real political and societal development, it seemed. So in China, however, and that's the interesting paradoxical point, established vanguard claims had been those by the Communist Party that saw itself as the ultimate vanguard of the people, of the so-called masses. It had institutionalized or established art forms, styles, and motives that were exactly dismissing, even persecuting those expressions associated with the historical European or contemporary Western avant-garde styles, such as post-impressionism, surrealism, cubism, fauvism, expressionism, Dadaism, or conceptual approaches, you name it, right? So for the party, that were the bourgeois elements, that were exactly those they wanted to purge. And the party in turn claimed to have fused art with life when absolutizing so-called socialist realism as basically the only permitted style. It thus effectively dismissed exactly those abstract, conceptual, and expressionist, etc. Styles as l'art pour l'art, which European avant-gardists had claimed to be closest to life. So this is the turnaround, the opposite. In a paradoxical way, and as late as at the beginning of the 1980s, we thus have artists reclaiming Chinese artists reclaiming European, early 20th century European styles as a critical means to break with state-prescribed avant-gardism that had taken the form of realist idioms. So and you can see here a very prominent icon, a wooden sculpture, not so large, actually only 57 centimeters high, which was done by Wang Keping and called Idol or Ocean. And you see it mimics Mao. He has one winking eye, which was also kind of an ironic pointing to him. And the statue is wearing that head with a communist star on top of it, so it can easily, and it was very easy for the masses and the onlookers to interpret that as a gesture that was highly deconstructive and was really attacking Mao, actually, in a time where the Cultural Revolution and Mao's death was just about over. And it was not yet sure how officials would react to that kind of a rendering. And here you see, I found at least one or two paintings where we can see how they actually looked in terms of coloring. And you see they have been very colorful indeed, some more, some less. And it's really difficult to tell from these small black and white prints. So in the wake of the Beijing Spring, a brief period beginning in October 1978 and ending in December 79, when citizens could post their liberal, even openly critical political opinions at the so-called Xidan Wall of Democracy, the Star's first show, the Star's outdoor art exhibition, Xingxing Lutian Meijian, was an immediate and spectacular success. So it was not largely announced, but people immediately were drawn to this exhibitions place. Tired of lengthy negotiations with the authorities, so they had tried to get official exhibition rooms, but they failed. Regarding a space to exhibit, the group resolved to simply install 150 works by 23 artists on a fence surrounding a park adjacent to the China National Art Gallery that you see here in the back. On the morning of the 27th September 1979. Immediately drawing large crowds of enthusiastic onlookers, the show, however, challenged the authorities, who ultimately closed it down on its third day. So it was really, the authorities were not sure at all how to handle that a grassroots movement from the masses, so to say. Also, although the stars reached a compromise with the cultural authorities, who ensured them that they would be able to reopen the exhibition in mid-October in Beihai Park's exhibition pavilions that were run by the Beijing Association of Artists. They later drafted this united proclamation asking the Beijing Municipal Party Committee to correct the police department's misconduct, because the police had shut down the exhibition and they even confiscated the work. So the artists were really mad at the authorities. When the committee did not respond to these points immediately, the stars and their friends from the independent journal Jintian Today went on to lead a protest march on October 1st, 1979. And this was actually the 30th anniversary of the People's Republic, so a very big national holiday. And they used these slogans, as you see here, in their protest march. According to STARS member Wang Keping, it was, I quote, the first non-government organized demonstration in 30 years, and about 1,000 people had joined the march in the end. So you really can see the masses of people there, because basically any kind of public rally was still very much attractive these days, because it has been rare that the people could just express their opinions. Given that on October 16, 1979, activist Wei Jingsheng was sentenced to 15 years in prison for calling for democracy in his essay, The Fifth Modernization, posted at the Xidan Wall 1 year earlier, it is indeed quite astonishing that the stars only had to wait for a few weeks to reopen their show in Beihai Park, selling 500 tickets on the first day already. And the photographic prints that I showed you. So they used these prints instead of a catalog, because they had no access to printing a catalog. That was really rare at that time and only done for huge commemorative party exhibitions. So the exhibition was now also mediated by established Chinese media. And in March 1980, the official art magazine Meishu Fine Arts published an article by Li Xianting, which was, I quote Wang Keping again, the first domestic commentary to introduce the stars, not counting internally critical documents, internally circulating documents that were critical of the stars. So also the fact that Li Xianting, who was then become a very outspoken and one of the foremost critics to introduce the subsequent 85 new art wave and new later generations of artists to the West, although the fact that he was able to even publish a cover story about this exhibition in an official magazine was something really new and groundbreaking, because this also had to pass the official censorship, right? And it did at that time in March 1980. So I can show you another coverage, which was not in Meishu, but it was in the magazine China Reconstructed, which was another article featuring these artworks. And here you see some color reproductions. So subsequently, the artist established the Stars Art Society, Xingxing Huahui, and officially registered it with the Beijing Association of Artists. Backed by the latter's president, Huang Rui, Ma Desheng, and Wang Keping, the three eminent founding members, became members of the Beijing Association of Artists, which marked their transition from amateur status to professional artists in the view of cultural officials. So you can see they were even they became more and more accepted and established for a short time. So it seemed really to open up a path for them, a professional career. And finally, they succeeded in exhibiting within the China National Art Gallery itself, where the second art exhibitions of the stars, Die Jie Xingxing Meizhan, saw nearly 100,000 visitors in 16 days. During August and September 1980. So here you see the real entrance, and you see people queuing up to see that exhibition. And again, they show for 16 days now within the China Art Gallery. So that's a glorious moment for this group. Their position in Chinese art history was, however, still undecided. On the one hand, Huang Rui and Ma Zheng were so famous that they received invitations by many work units and visited 26 cities, giving about 10 talks on the stars and contemporary art until January 1981, using the money derived by selling the photographic prints. On the other hand, works that they had submitted for an exhibition of the Beijing Association of Artists were, I quote Wang Keping again, thrown into the garbage on the very next day, and the core members of the stars themselves grew increasingly tired of managing group dynamics and longed to embark on individual careers. So soon the party stopped cultural liberalization again, and the police began frequently interrogating core members of the artist group, visibly putting them under surveillance, and in the end, Wang Keping, Huang Rui and Ma Zheng learned that, I quote Wang Keping again, they were barred from taking part in exhibitions, from having their names mentioned in any media, and from joining any government organization, end of quote. So here they totally lost their status again. Most of them sought and eventually managed to leave China for France, USA, Japan, or other countries. Today, at least, and so this was a moment of international glorious momentary reception, and this all fell back when they got banned and had to leave China. And Wang Keping actually has a beautiful catalog where he really in great detail retells the story of these exhibitions and also shows his later works. He's now based in Paris. Today, at least the art historical discourse inside and outside of China seems critically aware of the value and the need to discuss such artist groups, their work in remaining documents. While it is less clear to what degree Chinese political agents will acknowledge and support the re-actualization of the star's achievements. The ambivalent, if not outright negative official reaction, the partly ongoing media and exhibition censorship, or even unfounded state violence, which some of the matured members of the stars, such as Ai Weiwei and Huang Rui, have met, tell us that their historical vanguard stances and the photographic mediation that I showed to you are not simply past history. Despite a series of retrospective exhibitions that I have listed here, and the affiliated Chinese literature on the stars that I showed you, their relevance in the eyes of subsequent generations of Chinese artists and those coming of age today has long been very dependent on the individual commitment of Huang Rui and other core members to continue exhibiting and documenting the stars' legacy. On the occasion of their 40th anniversary, we can, however, see that artists, critics, curators, and art historians working together across and beyond various national, cultural, and historical borders with a shared and critical interest in notions of the avant-garde have succeeded to put Beijing 1979 and 8 and the stars in particular on global maps of the avant-garde. This does change the limited Eurocentric accounts that previously prevailed, and I'm optimistic that what we are going to see in the coming years will be research that further whirls the avant-garde as opposed to approaches that have tried to naively or uncritically add non-Western positions in order to get a global understanding of these practices. So, in my view, besides contextualizing individual artworks, this necessitates unpacking cultural entanglements, following an agent-centered approach and questioning fundamental cultural as well as epistemological conditions that frame our views on what constitutes an avant-garde. And with this last slide on the most recent exhibition of the stars that really, as you see here, reconstructed literally the fence and also managed to put some of the original remaining artworks on display while having photographs that's a supplement for the lost works. I'd like to close now and also open the discussion for your questions. And hope that you enjoyed listening to it and that I was not so much over time.
Thanks so much, Franziska. It was so interesting to listen all your explanations. You bring to us a lot of ideas to think and to carry on our work. And now it's a time to ask whatever you have, the persons that are here in the Aula Magna, the people that are at home. If you have any questions to Franziska Koch, it's a really good moment. Mei.
Hi, Dr. Koch. Very nice to meet you in person. Actually, I think some years ago, I have read one of your article, if I didn't remember, review of the after, I think China after 1989 in Guggenheim Museum, and I think it was written by you, right?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
I didn't remember wrong. Okay. First, thank you. I think it's very interesting presentation, and I've been thinking a lot because it's quite a lot of information to process. But I was thinking, because I saw your quotations and also the examples you're giving us, and I think with the quotations and also the series that's perhaps in your research is perhaps you may correct me if I'm wrong, within the framework of globalization. But I think the current trend nowadays is more like toward deglobalization. And how do you think this is going to relate with or affect with the art and culture aspect today?
Okay, yeah, I'm not sure I'm really understanding. So you suggest saying that art historians try to de-globalize, because I can see both movements in a way. So the chair of global art history, when that was installed in Heidelberg, it was 2009, if I'm not mistaken, or 9. That was a new trend to say we have to cater and to account for much more entangled histories that all have somehow relate to global things, but they are also very localized. And in Heidelberg, and I think that holds true probably for Spanish context as well, or for most European countries, we tended to have institutes for European art history, right? And then if you were lucky, kind of, maybe you had a professor for East Asian art history or Chinese art history in particular. And I can tell you that in the whole of Germany, until these days, there is no professor even for the history of Indian art, right? So that's astonishing. You have, of course, you have institutes that cover South Asia, and if you're lucky, you have someone also dealing with visual material and art historical topics, but that's about it. So so first of all, I would like to say that that the global 1990s actually brought forth a global a desire to come to terms with this most current globalization. But then again, it risks that there's a presentism, that people think, oh, this is so new. It's only now that we have the internet and the post-Cold War, like Cold War is over and people can fly to China and Chinese students are in Heidelberg and so on and so forth. Now that's a global moment, and that's all tied also to contemporary consciousness, while the past has been different. But actually the transcultural approach that we try to suggest and teach in Heidelberg has a very strong insistence on historicity and historical developments. And that's where I would say, yes, there is an emphasis in not conflating the global and say we just have to add all these avant-garde histories and stances and we just acknowledge them all equal, and then we are done. No, the historical focus means that you really look into power structures, you look into who are the agents, who could paint what, when, where, why, and who is written out of the picture. Like Kent Monkman saying, there were no Greek, indigenous role models for him as a painter. He was taught by white settlers in a way, and he was increasingly uncomfortable of being misrepresented and being not there and having no role models and following a template that was so utterly European that you can even ask why it has become so relevant for Canada, which is North American context, right? So in that regard, I would agree and say, yes, there are also tendencies to come to pay more attention to the local. And so our latest debates in Heidelberg are very much around scaling. So we say it's not only about the local and the global and how they interact. It's not only about the Xinxing artists in 1979 and 80, how they could access international discourse via illustrations, black and white photographs, via meeting international ambassadors or something, but it's also about scale. So you have to be very, so for them, it was also a national moment, right? It was another national impetus to come to terms with what China could mean after Mao. And so also the stars have an insistence on something that they wanted to be the vanguards for that country and their culture, while actively turning away from Chinese role models, as he said. So it's very important to gain insights in these intricacies and the differences that each of these contexts plays. And I did that exercise for fun. I just looked up who have been influential 1980s painter in Spain and in Germany, and I was utterly struck because actually from today's perspective, if we could compare what was we had a new figurative expressionism in Germany, at least, and I mean a sculptor like Trinidad, is it his name, right? Eduardo Trinidad. So he was also, yeah. So he did a huge bronze thing also in front of our Bundestag, the parliament, the chancellor's ministry in Germany. So he's so famous also in Germany. And if we compare that to Wang Keping's abstract, semi-abstract wooden sculptures, they were smaller, of course, in scale. But actually the German expressionist, like new figurative expressionist painter, didn't look so much more avant-garde than the stars actually did at that moment, even though, of course, in terms of material, they had very different approaches and they couldn't use all what they wanted, surely. So I was struck seeing that actually, if you look into that also in a local German or Spanish context, you will find out more entanglements that we are officially acknowledging, at least in the canonical museums, right? You won't see a stars painting in Barcelona Museum of Modern Art, I guess, and you don't see it for sure in a German museum. But yeah, if you go now to the Guggenheim and get a retrospective of contemporary Chinese art, you will at least find these Xing star artists acknowledged in the catalog, or sometimes even a photograph or something like that in a vitrine, kind of as if it were the prehistory, like the predecessors of that more glorious contemporary Chinese art. I hope it answers your question.
Well, thank you.
Thanks. There is another question, some comments. I would like to ask just a concrete question in relation of these exhibitions, of these retrospective exhibitions of the stars. Do you know what was the reception?
Yeah, I think the reception of these last ones, they have been in OCAD, and I actually, my article was translated into Chinese, but it all fell under the pandemic all of a sudden. So I know it opened and I know they still worked on the catalog, but then I have lost track. So I don't really know, and I should really urgently reconnect to Holly Russell, whom I was in contact. And I think they did a very thorough job in now really uncovering and documenting so nicely and getting Wu Hong into the picture. He's one of the outspoken critics and also curators and art historians. So he's a specialist of pre-modern Chinese art, but he did a brilliant job to mediate all that entanglements for a long time between the US, and he was I think he's now emeritus of Chicago University, and doing exhibitions in China. So that's just my intuition. It's utterly important for the coming of age contemporary art students today, and also for the latest generation audiences to see this legacy. But of course, it also carries this risk that something gets so much canonized that other early art groups kind of fall out of the picture because they have not managed to keep in a group form, nor even have individual careers in the West, while Huang Rui and Ma Desheng and Wang Keping, they managed. So they have a special place in these early groups. But I know that Julia F. Andrews, from also an emeritus from US American University, I think it's Pennsylvania, if I'm not wrong, she is also very active in always recuperating these early artist groups and also introducing it to a Western audience.
Thanks so much. I don't know if there is more questions, comments. If not, we will close here. Thanks again.
You must be very tired altogether. I saw you had a huge, fascinating program the whole day already. Yeah.
Yes,
And if you have questions, please come and write to me. Laia can forward my address to anyone. And also I provided some literature that we use by Monika Juneja in Heidelberg to generally tackle the modernist and the question how to approach it in a transcultural view. So I hope you take the advantage of getting some of the scans.
I will share all these papers that you bring to me yesterday, because I think that will be really useful for all the students and as well for all the professors that take part of this conference today. I will send to them all these papers. And thanks again, because now I think that we need time to process all the information to make the digestion, no? And we hope to meet you again and to carry on. And thanks again to all of you.
I would love to come to Barcelona to enjoy your reopened street coffees. I heard you can already sit in coffee shops again, and I'm so envious. With that, it's just seems it's still some weeks away. And yeah, let's hope next time we are all vaccinated and able to travel again.
Yes, I'm sure that we will have the time. Thanks again.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and I look forward to keep in touch.
Fantastic. Thanks, Franziska. Thanks to
Bye,
all of
Laia.
you. Bye.
Bye,
Cerraremos la sesión. Queremos agradecer de nuevo vuestra participación, vuestros comentarios, vuestras reflexiones, tanto a los ponentes que nos acompañan a lo largo del día de hoy como a las diferentes personas que estáis en el aula magna o en vuestras casas. Y evidentemente este es un punto de partida para continuar pensando y compartiendo todos estos intereses que tenemos en relación a la producción cultural en China. Gracias de nuevo y esperamos vernos pronto todos presencialmente. Lo dejamos aquí. Adiós, gracias.
Adiós,
Bye.
gracias.
Adiós.